Move. This is my seat now. Madison. Pierce's voice cracked slightly as she spoke, betraying the anxiety that had been building all morning beneath her carefully constructed confidence. Her hands shook as she adjusted her ring light, for the fourth time, the tremor barely visible but there nonetheless. The words came out sharper than she'd intended, but backing down wasn't an option when 8,000 people were watching her live stream. At 28, Madison had spent 5 years building an empire of aspiration from her childhood bedroom in suburban Columbus. But the foundation was cracking. Her Adderall prescription wasn't covering the anxiety anymore. 3 brand partnerships had paused their relationships after her problematic Memorial Day post. Her parents had started asking pointed questions about why she needed to borrow money for rent when her Instagram showed constant luxury. She'd claimed seat 1A on flight 284, despite her boarding pass clearly reading 1B, and the distinction felt like life or death. Window seats caught better light. Better angles meant better content. Better content meant keeping the lifestyle afloat for another month. Flying first class again, besties, she said to her phone, forcing her voice into its practiced honey-sweet tone. Denver to Miami because your girl has some... She paused, realizing she didn't actually have any meetings lined up. Major opportunities brewing. Can't say too much yet, but get ready for some exciting announcements. The viewer count was stuck at 8,247. Last year, a travel day stream would have hit 50,000 easy. The algorithm changes had been brutal, but Madison couldn't admit that to her audience. Weakness wasn't on brand. Comments trickled in from her remaining loyal followers. Queen taking over first class. Living for this energy. Teach us your ways. But Madison could see the truth in her analytics. Engagement was down 60%. The fake Hermes bag from Canal Street. The Stanley Cup from her last remaining partnership. The AirPods case positioned just so. All props in a performance that fewer and fewer people were buying. Her phone buzzed Madison. We need to talk about the Revolve situation. They're concerned about brand alignment. Call me ASAP. Sarah. Madison's stomach dropped. Revolve was her biggest partnership. $8,000 monthly guaranteed. Losing them would mean asking her parents for money, which would mean admitting the lifestyle was largely fictional. She was so absorbed in managing her anxiety that she didn't notice the man approaching until his shadow fell across her ring light. When she looked up, her brain made a quick calculation. Casually dressed black man. Simple backpack. No obvious designer pieces. Her influencer instinct saw opportunity. Here was someone who clearly didn't belong in first class, which meant she could create content around the drama while positioning herself as the victim. Madison had no idea she was about to destroy her entire life on camera. The irony was crushing the girl from Ohio, who'd once felt intimidated by wealth, was about to become the person who weaponized assumptions about who belonged where. The insecurity that had driven her to claim spaces through performance was about to make her deny someone else's legitimate right to the same space. Madison Pierce was 30 seconds away from the biggest mistake of her life. Isaiah Bennett stood in the aisle of Flight 284 boarding pass in hand and felt the familiar weight of being measured by strangers who would decide within seconds whether he belonged in their space. At 42, he'd learned to recognize the moment when someone looked at him and made rapid calculations about his legitimacy, his threat level, his right to be there. His faded Howard University hoodie had been through countless flights, board meetings, and congressional hearings. The small tear at the left elbow had happened during Zara's move-in day at Stanford, a memory that made him smile even now. His dark jeans were comfortable for the 4-hour flight, and his white sneakers were clean but unremarkable. Nothing about his appearance suggested the $3.2 billion net worth or the power to reshape entire industries. This was entirely intentional. The decision to put himself in this position hadn't come easily. 3 months ago, during one of his evening calls with Zara, she'd questioned the wisdom of deliberately exposing himself to discrimination. "Dad, I understand the systematic approach," she'd said, her voice carrying the mixture of admiration and concern that had marked their relationship since her mother's death 5 years earlier. "But watching people treat my father like he doesn't deserve basic respect, that hurts me, even when I know you have the power to respond." Isaiah's throat had tightened at her words. "Baby girl, every black professional has been through some version of this. The difference is that this time, we'll be ready to respond systematically instead of just enduring it privately. And maybe your children won't have to go through it at all." The boarding pass in his hand read 1A, but Isaiah knew the seat assignment was less important than what it represented. This flight was the culmination of 18 months of strategic planning, legal preparation, and psychological preparation for deliberately subjecting himself to the kind of treatment he'd spent his adult life trying to avoid. His chest tightened as a memory surfaced unbidden. 8 years old, standing with his parents in the lobby of Morrison Funeral Home on Chicago's South Side. They were dressed in their Sunday best for his grandmother's service, but the funeral director had looked them up and down with barely concealed skepticism. "Are you sure you're in the right place?" the man had asked. "The other service is downstairs." Even as a child, Isaiah had understood the weight of those pauses, the calculation behind that assumption. His parents had stood there with quiet dignity, while a stranger questioned their right to mourn their family member in the main chapel. That moment had planted something deep in his psyche. Not just anger, though that was there too, but systematic determination. A burning resolve that one day he would have enough power to ensure no other child experienced that particular flavor of humiliation. The path from that funeral home to seat 1A had been built on strategic decisions that most people would never understand. Stanford Computer Science, Harvard MBA, his senior thesis on using equity stakes to force institutional change, a paper his advisor had called academically interesting, but practically impossible to implement. The advisor had been wrong. His phone buzzed with a text from Elena Santos. "All systems ready. Legal team standing by. Media coordination prepared. Remember, stay calm. Document everything. Let them reveal themselves first." Another buzz from Zara. "Dad, my roommate's mom just posted something cryptic about major airline industry changes coming today. Please be careful. Love you." Isaiah typed back, "Love you too, baby girl. Watch Tyler Brooks's TikTok if you want to see how change really happens. This is for your future." He pocketed the phone and studied the scene before him. The young woman in his seat was performing for her camera, surrounded by professional equipment that claimed every inch of space around 1A. Her setup created a physical barrier that communicated ownership entitlement, the assumption that her presence was more legitimate than anyone else's. Isaiah had seen this performance countless times. The casual claiming of space that didn't belong to her. The expectation that others would simply accept displacement rather than assert their rights. The weaponization of victim status to deflect accountability. But this time, Isaiah wasn't a 16-year-old who had to swallow his dignity to avoid making his parents uncomfortable. He wasn't a junior employee who had to endure discrimination to keep his job. He wasn't someone who had to choose between his safety and his self-respect. This time, he had resources, legal backing, comprehensive preparation, and most importantly, the power to ensure that this moment of discrimination would be the catalyst for systematic change that protected millions of other people from experiencing what he'd experienced. 26 years after that funeral home, 34 years after being told he couldn't swim in a hotel pool despite having a room key, Isaiah Bennett was finally in a position to ensure that discrimination had consequences that matched its impact. He cleared his throat gently. Excuse me. Madison glanced up from her phone, and for a split second, her influencer mask slipped. Something flickered across her face. Uncertainty, maybe even recognition that this moment could spiral beyond her control. But her live stream was active. Her audience was watching, and weakness wasn't profitable when your entire income depended on projecting confidence. Besides, she thought maybe some drama would boost engagement. "Can I help you?" she asked, her voice carrying that particular tone of someone who had no intention of helping anyone. Isaiah held up his boarding pass, the gesture calm and unthreatening. "I believe you're in my seat. 1A. Madison's laugh was crystalline, but hollow like expensive glass about to shatter. "I don't think so, hun." She gestured to her elaborate setup. Ring light, casting professional glow phone, mounted at the perfect angle, designer accessories, claiming every available surface. "I mean, I was here first, and I've got all my stuff set up. That's how it works, right?" The pause that followed felt loaded with possibility. The moment when this could still go either direction. Dr. Angela Morrison looked up from her medical journal in seat 2C as the familiar dynamic began to unfold. At 54, she'd witnessed this script too many times to count. The subtle and not-so-subtle ways that black professionals were questioned, dismissed, or displaced by people who simply couldn't believe they belonged in premium spaces. Her own daughter, Keisha, had called just yesterday about a similar incident. "Mom," the attending asked me 3 times if I was sure I was supposed to be in the surgery, even though my name was literally on the schedule. This never gets easier to watch, Dr. Morrison thought, but she kept her attention focused on the interaction. In seat 3A, Tyler Brooks was already calculating angles. At 19, Tyler had developed an instinct for recognizing moments that could explode across social media. His journalism professor had drilled ethical frameworks into him. When does documentation serve justice? When does it become exploitation? But something about the man's demeanor, the careful calm, the way he held his boarding pass like evidence in a trial, suggested this wasn't random drama. Tyler's thumb hovered over the record button. "This feels intentional." Elena Vasquez, the immigration lawyer in 1C, was taking notes before she'd consciously decided to do so. Her legal training had taught her to recognize when interpersonal conflict crossed into potential civil rights violations. The woman's dismissive attitude, combined with the pointed assessment of the man's appearance, was raising red flags. This isn't about seeding confusion, Elena realized. This is about assumptions regarding who has the right to be where. Isaiah remained standing in the aisle, his expression unchanged, but Tyler's soon-to-be recording camera would capture the slight tightening around his eyes when Madison said, "I was here first." It was a phrase that carried particular weight for someone whose ancestors had been told their claims to space and dignity were invalid, regardless of documentation. "Actually, that's not how airline seating works," Isaiah replied evenly. "Seats are assigned based on purchased tickets, not arrival time. But I understand there might be some confusion." Madison's confidence wavered for just a moment. His response was too articulate, too controlled for someone she'd mentally categorized as a potential problem. But her audience was watching. Her brand was built on never backing down, and admitting error wasn't part of her carefully constructed persona. The algorithm rewards confidence, she reminded herself. Weakness kills engagement. "Look, I'm sure this is just a misunderstanding," Madison said, her voice rising slightly to carry to nearby passengers. She was performing now, not just for her live stream, but for the cabin audience. "But I'm settled in. I've got my equipment set up, and honestly—" She paused, her eyes taking in his casual appearance with barely concealed assessment. "I mean, look around. Look at you. Look at me. Does this really seem like the right fit?" The question hung in the air like toxic gas. Tyler's finger finally hit record. His live stream chat was still small, maybe 200 viewers, but something told him this was about to change. Comments started flowing. Wait, what's happening? Is this about to be messy? Someone about to get humbled? Dr. Morrison's hands stilled on her journal. She'd heard those exact words before, from a conference organizer who'd questioned her invitation to speak at a medical symposium, from a hotel clerk who'd insisted on calling his supervisor before honoring her reservation, from countless people who'd looked at her achievements and decided they couldn't possibly be legitimate. Elena Vasquez's pen was moving rapidly now, documenting everything. The woman's comment about fit, combined with her visual assessment, was textbook discrimination developing in real time. Isaiah's phone buzzed in his pocket. Probably Elena Santos checking in, but he didn't reach for it. Not yet. He wanted to give everyone involved one more chance to choose differently before he activated systems that couldn't be reversed. "Ms. Pierce," he said quietly, and the use of her name made Madison's eyes widen. How did he know her name? She hadn't introduced herself. "I'm not trying to create problems for anyone. I'd simply like to sit in the seat I purchased." Madison's social media training kicked in as she realized she was losing control of the narrative. Time for victim mode. It always played well with her audience. "Okay, I don't know what kind of situation this is," she said, her voice taking on a trembling quality that hadn't been there moments before. "But I'm just a young woman traveling alone, trying to mind my own business and create content for my followers. And this gentleman is being very persistent about intimidating me into giving up my seat." Tyler's camera caught the exact moment when polite disagreement became character assassination. Isaiah hadn't raised his voice, hadn't stepped closer, hadn't made any gesture that could be construed as threatening. But Madison had weaponized the word persistent and the implication of intimidating, terms that carried particular danger when applied to black men in confined spaces. Dr. Morrison had heard enough. She closed her journal and looked directly at Madison, her voice carrying 30 years of professional authority. "Excuse me, miss. I've been watching this entire interaction from the beginning. That gentleman has been nothing but polite and respectful. He presented a valid boarding pass and made a reasonable request. I haven't seen anything that could be characterized as intimidating behavior." Madison turned toward Dr. Morrison, her influencer mask slipping further. "Ma'am, I appreciate your concern, but you don't really understand what's happening here." "I understand perfectly," Dr. Morrison interrupted, her voice sharp with controlled anger. "I understand that you're in someone else's assigned seat, refusing to examine evidence that would resolve this immediately, and now making false characterizations of his behavior to justify your refusal to follow basic airline policies." The cabin had gone quiet except for the hum of engines and the distant murmur of passengers in economy starting to notice the tension in first class. Isaiah stood in the aisle, still calm, still waiting. His finger rested near his phone, ready to activate systems that would change everything. But he wanted to give everyone involved, Madison, the flight crew, the airline management, one final opportunity to simply do what should have been done from the beginning. Check the boarding passes, move the passenger to her correct seat, and allow the flight to proceed normally. It should have been that simple. But Isaiah knew it wouldn't be, because this wasn't really about seats or confusion or misunderstandings. This was about assumptions, and assumptions once voiced had consequences. That's when Jessica Chen approached, and Tyler could see the internal conflict playing out across her face as she tried to balance corporate training with basic fairness. At 34, Jessica had worked her way up from economy to first-class service, and she'd always told herself she treated all passengers equally. But looking at the situation in row 1, she felt her assumptions warring with her professional obligations. The optics were problematic from every angle. The young white woman had professional filming equipment and was clearly documenting her travels for a large social media audience. The kind of passenger who could damage an airline's reputation with a single viral post. The black man was soft-spoken and polite, but Jessica had been conditioned by years of performance reviews to prioritize customer satisfaction metrics above almost everything else. "Just check both boarding passes," her conscience whispered. "It's literally 30 seconds." But her career survival instincts whispered something different. The influencer has thousands of people watching. The other passenger is alone. Which choice protects your job? "Good morning, folks," Jessica said, her voice carrying forced brightness that didn't match her nervous body language. "Is there something I can help sort out here?" Madison immediately pivoted to wounded victim mode, her whole demeanor shifting like she'd flipped a switch. "Oh, thank God you're here. This gentleman has been super aggressive about trying to get me out of my seat, even though I was obviously here first and I have all my equipment set up." Her voice carried just the right note of feminine vulnerability, mixed with reasonable frustration. Jessica's eyes flicked between the elaborate ring light setup and Isaiah's calm expression, then toward Tyler, whose phone was obviously recording, then to Dr. Morrison, who was watching with the intensity of someone taking mental notes. Too many witnesses for this to disappear quietly, Jessica realized. Whatever choice I make here is going to be documented. "Sir, could I take a look at your boarding pass?" Jessica asked, extending her hand. Isaiah handed it over immediately. No hesitation, no defensiveness. Jessica scanned the barcode with her device. Her screen displayed clearly, Seat 1A, confirmed, Bennett Isaiah. For just a moment, Jessica stared at the screen, hoping it would show something different. But the assignment was clear, verified, legitimate. The right thing to do was obvious and simple. "Ma'am, I'll need to see your boarding pass as well," Jessica said, turning to Madison. Madison's confident facade cracked slightly. "Why do I need to prove anything? I'm the one being harassed here." But she held up her phone, showing her mobile boarding pass 1B. The evidence was undeniable. Isaiah had the correct boarding pass for 1A. Madison was in the wrong seat. Case closed. But Jessica looked at Madison's live stream setup, at the viewer count, climbing past 12,000, at the potential for negative publicity that could affect her performance reviews, and made a choice that would haunt her for months. "Sir, would you mind stepping aside for just a moment while we figure out the best solution? I'm sure we can find you another comfortable seat that works for everyone." The words landed in the cabin like a small explosion. Tyler's live stream chat went absolutely wild. No, she didn't. The flight attendant really just chose the white girl over facts. This is insane to watch live. Someone screen record this. Dr. Morrison actually gasped audibly. Elena Vasquez's pen stopped moving mid-sentence as she stared at Jessica in disbelief. Isaiah nodded slowly, his expression unchanged, but something shifting in his posture. Not defeat, but preparation. "Of course, take all the time you need." But as he stepped slightly aside, his hand moved to his phone. The interface that appeared was sleek, professional, and unlike anything the other passengers had ever seen. Nexus Digital Solutions, Executive Access, Skyline. Airways, Partnership Monitoring, Equity Protocol. Delta 7, Standby. Incident detected. Seat assignment. Dispute, bias indicators. Multiple triggers activated. Witness count, 47 passengers, 6 crew members. Social media, live documentation, active. Corporate liability, escalating. Activate, comprehensive monitoring. Yes or no. Isaiah's thumb hovered over yes, but he hesitated. Once he pressed that button, there would be no going back. Lives would change, careers would end, systems would be transformed. He looked at Jessica, who was clearly uncomfortable with her own decision, but trapped by corporate conditioning that valued perceived customer satisfaction over actual policy compliance. He looked at Madison, who was adjusting her ring light to better capture what she obviously considered her moment of triumph. He looked at Dr. Morrison, whose professional composure couldn't hide her disgust at what she was witnessing. In his pocket, his phone buzzed with a text from Zara. "Dad, whatever you're about to do, remember that I love you, and I believe in what you're fighting for. Change the world. 26 years. 26 years since that funeral home director had questioned his family's right to grieve in dignity. 26 years of similar moments, similar assumptions, similar choices by people who looked at him and decided he didn't belong. But this time was different. This time, he had preparation, legal backing, systematic support, and most importantly, the power to ensure that this moment of discrimination would catalyze changes that protected millions of other people from experiencing what he'd experienced. Isaiah pressed yes. Immediately, notifications began cascading. Cabin monitoring, active witness documentation. Recording, corporate oversight, alerted legal team. Standing by. Media coordination. Ready. 300 miles away in Chicago. Elena Santos was settling into her morning routine when every screen in her command center lit up with alerts. After 18 months of preparation, the most comprehensive bias documentation and response system in corporate history had just been activated. Madison was still performing for her camera, completely unaware that she had just triggered a response that would reshape not just her life, but the entire airline industry. Isaiah Bennett stood in the aisle of Flight 284, no longer just a passenger facing discrimination, but the catalyst for systematic transformation of how bias was identified, documented, and addressed across multiple industries. The test had officially begun. Elena Santos was reviewing quarterly compliance reports in her Chicago office when her secure workstation exploded with alerts that made her coffee cup freeze halfway to her lips. As Director of Equity Operations for Nexus Digital Solutions, she'd spent 18 months preparing for this moment. But the reality of Equity Protocol Delta 7 going live still sent adrenaline coursing through her system. This is actually happening. Her command center transformed from routine monitoring to full crisis coordination in seconds. Wall-mounted displays flickered to life, showing real-time data streams from Flight 284 that painted a comprehensive picture of discrimination unfolding in real time. Flight 284. Live incident analysis. Passenger, Isaiah Bennett. CEO, status confirmed. Current status. Displaced from assigned seat 1A. Incident classification. Explicit bias, plus employee, enabling witnesses. 47 passengers. 6 crew members. Social media live broadcast. Reaching 15,000 plus viewers. Legal threshold. Federal civil rights violation. Confirmed. Corporate exposure. Maximum liability. All right, people. This is what we've been preparing for, Elena announced to her response team via secure conference call. We have active discrimination documentation on Flight 284, legal media federal compliance, and corporate relations teams. Everyone online now. Back on the aircraft, Isaiah's phone displayed a simplified but powerful version of Elena's coordination dashboard. Executive Command Center. Phase 2. Ready. Current evidence package. Explicit discriminatory language. Captured. Employee policy violation. Documented. Multiple professional witnesses. Active. Live social media documentation. Ongoing. Federal civil rights thresholds met. Warning. Phase 2. Escalation cannot be reversed. Continue to identity revelation. Standby. Isaiah pocketed his phone and surveyed the cabin. Madison was still adjusting her ring light, basking in what she clearly thought was her victory. Jessica was hovering near the galley, looking increasingly uncomfortable with her choice. Dr. Morrison was watching everything with the focused intensity of someone who understood exactly what was happening. And Tyler's live stream was gaining momentum as viewers shared the feed across platforms. Comments were flowing faster than anyone could read. This man is too calm for someone getting discriminated against. Something bigger is happening here. Why is he smiling like that? Plot twist incoming. I can feel it. Elena Vasquez had been quietly researching Isaiah Bennett on her phone while documenting the incident. What she found made her breath catch in her throat. Nexus, Digital Solutions, founder and CEO, net worth, $3.2 billion, specialization, institutional bias, detection, recent acquisitions, significant transportation sector, equity stakes, board positions, FAA Advisory Committee, Civil Rights Commission. Elena looked up from her phone at Isaiah with dawning recognition. This isn't a random passenger dealing with airline discrimination. This is someone who has the resources and influence to reshape entire industries. Dr. Morrison was reaching the same conclusion through professional memory. She'd heard Isaiah speak at Stanford Medical's Diversity Summit about using artificial intelligence to identify treatment disparities in healthcare settings. His calm demeanor suddenly made perfect sense. This wasn't someone reacting to unexpected discrimination. This was someone who had planned for exactly this scenario. Madison, oblivious to the shifting dynamics around her, was responding to her live stream comments. "You guys, I honestly can't with this whole situation. Like I'm just trying to get to Miami for my brand collaborations, and now I have to deal with all this drama. But don't worry, your girl knows how to handle herself." The casual dismissal, reducing Isaiah to all this drama, was being captured by multiple recording devices and would soon be analyzed by bias detection algorithms with 97% accuracy rates. Jessica returned from the galley with regional manager Derek Hamilton in tow. Derek, 48, had built his 15-year career on resolving passenger disputes efficiently and quietly. But walking into first class on Flight 284, he immediately sensed this situation was different. The black passenger was standing with unusual composure for someone being displaced from his seat. The blonde influencer was live streaming to thousands of viewers while refusing to move. Multiple passengers were actively recording, and the tension felt less like confusion and more like anticipation. "What seems to be the issue here?" Derek asked, his corporate smile, not quite masking his assessment that this could become a PR nightmare. Isaiah's response was measured. "No issue from my perspective, Mr. Hamilton. I'm simply waiting for standard airline seating policies to be followed. I have a confirmed boarding pass for 1A, which is currently occupied by someone with a confirmed boarding pass for 1B. The precision of Isaiah's language, mentioning standard policies rather than complaining about unfairness, signaled to Derek that this passenger understood corporate frameworks better than most. Derek's mental calculation was swift. The influencer has 17,000 people watching her live stream. The other passenger, while articulate, represents a potential disruption that could damage our reputation if mishandled. Sir, I appreciate your patience. Let's see if we can find you an upgraded seat that works better for everyone involved." The young lady has her equipment set up, and Isaiah raised his hand slightly, a gesture that somehow commanded immediate attention despite its gentleness. "Mr. Hamilton, before you continue, I want to give you and your team one opportunity to simply follow your own seating policies. Check both boarding passes, seat the passengers according to their actual assignments, and allow the flight to proceed normally." Derek hesitated. There was something in Isaiah's tone, not threatening, but carrying an undertone of authority that suggested this passenger might have resources Derek hadn't considered. "Well, sir, in the interest of customer satisfaction for all our passengers," Isaiah's thumb moved to his phone screen. Phase 2 was about to begin. Derek Hamilton's radio crackled with the authoritative voice of Security Officer Marcus Webb Management. I'm en route to assist with the passenger situation. ETA 90 seconds. Derek felt relief mixed with apprehension. Marcus was good at his job, professional, efficient, and skilled at resolving conflicts without creating viral social media disasters. But something about the dynamics in first class was making Derek increasingly uneasy. The displaced passenger, Bennett, according to Jessica's report, wasn't behaving like someone getting screwed over. Most people in his situation would be getting louder, more agitated, demanding to speak to managers. Bennett was doing the opposite, becoming calmer and more controlled as the situation developed. That's not normal, Derek thought. People don't get more composed when they're being discriminated against, unless they know something I don't. Madison, meanwhile, was feeding off her growing audience like a performer energized by applause. Her live stream had climbed past 20,000 viewers, and the attention was intoxicating. Besties, I literally cannot believe this airplane drama, she announced to her phone, her voice carrying the practiced breathlessness of someone creating content from conflict. Like, I'm just trying to live my life and create amazing content for you beautiful people. But apparently some people think they can just intimidate young women who are traveling alone. Tyler's journalistic training was screaming warnings. Madison's narrative didn't match the reality he was witnessing and recording. Isaiah hadn't raised his voice, hadn't moved aggressively, hadn't done anything that could reasonably be called intimidating. But she was crafting a story that painted her as the victim of behavior that simply wasn't happening. This is dangerous, Tyler realized. She's creating a false narrative in real time to 20,000 people. His TikTok comments were increasingly polarized. Team Madison supporters, stand your ground. Queen, don't let him bully you. You were there first. Reality-based viewers, he literally just showed his boarding pass. She's obviously in the wrong seat. This is about to backfire so hard. Gen Z skeptics. This is giving main character syndrome. Ma'am, this man is being respectful. The way she really thought she did something. When Marcus Webb entered the cabin, his trained security assessment immediately cataloged the scene professionally. Composed black passenger, holding boarding pass documentation. White female social media personality, with elaborate filming setup, claiming disputed territory. Multiple witnesses, actively recording cabin atmosphere, charged with anticipation rather than anger. Marcus had handled enough situations to recognize when things were about to explode in unexpected directions. Good morning, everyone, Marcus said, his voice carrying practiced calm. I'm Officer Webb with Airport Security. I understand we have some seating confusion that needs sorting out. Isaiah's response was respectful, but precise. Officer Webb, there's no confusion on my part. I have a confirmed boarding pass for seat 1A, which is currently occupied by a passenger, with a confirmed boarding pass for 1B. I'm waiting for standard airline protocols to be implemented. The careful language, standard protocols instead of complaints about unfair treatment, told Marcus this passenger understood corporate procedures and legal frameworks better than average. Madison immediately launched into performance mode. Officer, thank God you're here. This gentleman has been super persistent and honestly kind of aggressive about trying to force me out of my seat. I was here first. I have all my equipment set up, and he's been making me really uncomfortable with how insistent he's being. Marcus looked between Madison's elaborate social media setup and Isaiah's calm demeanor, then at the boarding documentation Derek was holding. The paperwork was straightforward. Isaiah had 1A. Madison had 1B. This should have been resolved in 30 seconds. But Marcus also saw the live stream counter showing over 20,000 viewers, the potential for viral content that could damage multiple careers, and the racial dynamics that made every choice professionally dangerous. Black man, white woman confined space, her claiming he's aggressive. This could explode in any direction. Dr. Morrison, who had been observing with growing frustration. finally stood from seat 2C. Her voice carried the authority of someone accustomed to life-and-death decision-making under pressure. Officer Webb. I need to interject here. I've been watching this entire situation unfold from the beginning, and I feel obligated to provide accurate witness testimony. Marcus turned toward her, recognizing both her professional bearing and her potential credibility as a witness. The gentleman has been completely respectful and professional throughout this interaction. Dr. Morrison continued her medical training, evident in her precise, factual delivery. He presented documentation, made a reasonable request, and has shown no aggressive behavior whatsoever. The young woman, however, has been making increasingly dramatic characterizations that don't match the behavior I've observed. Derek Hamilton felt the situation sliding beyond his control. Having a medical professional provide contradictory witness testimony was destroying his preferred narrative of a simple customer service situation that could be quietly resolved. Elena Vasquez looked up from her legal notes and added her professional perspective. Officer Webb. I'm an attorney, and I've been documenting this interaction for legal purposes. The boarding passes clearly establish seating assignments, and what we're witnessing appears to be a refusal to follow airline policies combined with false characterizations of the affected passenger's behavior. Marcus Webb internally groaned. A doctor and a lawyer providing professional witness testimony. This was not going to be a quiet resolution. Tyler's live stream was approaching 30,000 viewers as word spread across social platforms. The hashtag Flight284 was beginning to trend, and major social media accounts were starting to share the feed. In her Chicago command center, Elena Santos was coordinating with teams that Derek and Marcus couldn't imagine existed. Congressional Commerce Committee staff are monitoring the situation. FAA Compliance Division has been briefed. Stock market analysis shows early volatility. Media response teams are standing by. We're moving to Phase 2 authorization. Isaiah checked his phone discreetly. Phase 2 approved. Identity revelation sequence initiated. All federal notifications sent. This is about to become very public very quickly. Marcus Webb made his professional assessment. I'd like to examine both boarding passes, please. Derek handed over the documentation, and Marcus scanned both with his device. The results were unambiguous. Isaiah's pass confirmed seat 1A. Madison's showed 1B. Ma'am, Marcus addressed Madison with professional courtesy. Your boarding pass indicates seat 1B. I'm going to need you to collect your belongings and move to your assigned seat. Madison's confident facade finally began to crack. This is absolutely ridiculous. I was here first. I have everything set up. You're seriously going to side with him over a simple misunderstanding. The pause before him was loaded with implication that everyone in the cabin heard clearly, because what exactly Dr. Morrison asked, her voice sharp, with controlled anger. Madison looked around desperately, suddenly aware that the narrative she'd been crafting wasn't resonating with the witnesses surrounding her. Her live stream comments were becoming increasingly critical as viewers recognized what was actually happening. This isn't fair, Madison whispered, but she began gathering her ring light and phone equipment with shaking hands. Isaiah watched the scene unfold with calm satisfaction, but he knew the real test was just beginning. Moving Madison to her correct seat would resolve the immediate dispute, but it wouldn't address the systematic issues that had allowed the discrimination to occur in the first place. His phone buzzed. Phase 2 complete. Phase 3. Authorization available. Media coordination ready. Federal oversight activated. Stock market reacting. Ready to proceed. Isaiah typed back. Phase 3. Authorized. Begin comprehensive response protocol. The individual consequences were about to begin, but the systematic changes would transform how every airline in America handled similar situations forever. The seat dispute was over. The real confrontation was about to start. The moment Madison began packing her equipment, while muttering under her breath about unfair treatment and reverse discrimination, Dr. Morrison realized this situation was about to escalate beyond a simple seating correction into something much more dangerous and revealing. "Excuse me, doctor," Morrison said, her voice cutting through the cabin noise with surgical precision. "Did you just use the phrase reverse discrimination?" Madison froze, her ring light, half collapsed, suddenly aware that her whispered comments had been audible to other passengers. Her live stream was still active, and over 25,000 viewers had just heard her characterize being asked to sit in her assigned seat as discrimination against her. I didn't mean anything by that." Madison backpedaled quickly, but the damage was done. Tyler's TikTok chat exploded. She said, "Reverse discrimination. Ma'am, you're literally in the wrong seat. The audacity is unmatched." Someone said, "Reverse racism," about sitting in her assigned seat. This is why we document everything. Elena Vasquez's legal training kicked in immediately. And there it is. The implicit bias just became explicit discrimination. This just crossed into federal civil rights violation territory. Isaiah remained silent, but his phone was buzzing with real-time updates from Elena Santos. Explicit bias, language detected. Reverse discrimination. Legal threshold exceeded. Civil rights violation. Confirmed. Witness testimony. Multiple professional sources. Video documentation. 14+ recording devices. All angles. Social media impact. 25,000+ live. Viewers trending nationally. Federal notification agencies alerted and monitoring. Dr. Morrison wasn't finished. Her 30 years of navigating discrimination in medical settings had given her a low tolerance for the kind of entitled behavior she was witnessing. "Young lady, let me make sure I understand your position," Dr. Morrison said, her voice carrying the authority of someone who had delivered difficult diagnoses to powerful people. "You claimed a seat that didn't belong to you. Refused to examine documentation that would have resolved the issue immediately. And when finally asked to sit in your actual assigned seat, you called it reverse discrimination. Against whom exactly?" Madison's influencer training completely deserted her when faced with a professional woman who wasn't intimidated by her social media following or impressed by her performance of victimhood. "Look, I don't know what kind of setup this is," Madison snapped, her carefully crafted public persona cracking like cheap paint under pressure. "But I'm not stupid. This whole thing feels orchestrated. A random black guy demanding my seat, everyone taking his side cameras everywhere." She gestured wildly at the recording devices surrounding her. "It's like you people planned this whole thing. You people." The phrase hit the cabin like a pressure drop at altitude. Tyler actually dropped his phone for a second, scrambling to catch it, while his chat went absolutely insane. Elena Vasquez stopped writing mid-sentence, her pen hovering over her notepad. Marcus Webb's hand moved instinctively toward his radio. But it was Dr. Morrison's response that would be replayed across social media for months. "You people?" Her voice was quiet, but it carried through the cabin like a scalpel cutting through tissue. "Ms. Pierce, and yes, I can see your name on your live stream. You people planned what exactly?" "Planned for a black passenger to have the audacity to sit in a seat he purchased. Planned for airline staff to eventually follow their own policies. Planned for you to reveal exactly who you are when your assumptions are challenged." Madison realized she'd crossed a line that couldn't be uncrossed, but instead of retreating, panic made her double down. "I'm just trying to protect myself here. A young white woman traveling alone, and everyone's ganging up on me because of some guy who probably doesn't even belong in first class anyway. Probably doesn't even belong in first class anyway." The words landed like physical blows. Isaiah's composed expression showed the slightest crack. Not anger, but something deeper, a kind of weary recognition that even with all his preparation, all his power, all his strategic positioning, he was still hearing the same assumptions that had followed him his entire life. Elena Vasquez stood up from her seat, her legal training compelling her to respond to what she was witnessing in real time. Ms. Pierce, you just articulated the core assumption that has driven this entire incident, Elena said, her voice carrying the precision of someone who spent her career fighting discrimination in federal courts. You looked at this gentleman, someone you had never met, knew nothing about, and decided he probably doesn't belong in the same space you feel entitled to claim. That's not confusion. That's not self-protection. That's textbook discrimination. The cabin had divided into clear sides. The passengers supporting accountability, Dr. Morrison, Elena Vasquez Tyler, and several others, were looking at Madison with expressions ranging from disgust to professional interest. A few passengers were trying to avoid eye contact, uncomfortable with the confrontation. And Madison was increasingly isolated, her live stream audience turning against her in real time. Comments were brutal. Did she just say he doesn't belong in first class? The racism jumped out. Ma'am, this is 2024. How are you? This bold with the discrimination. Someone screenshot everything before she deletes Marcus. Webb found himself managing a situation that had escalated far beyond passenger relations into explicit racial bias, with multiple professional witnesses and comprehensive documentation. Derek Hamilton was experiencing his own crisis as he watched Madison's comments transform what could have been a minor customer service issue into a potential federal discrimination case. 20 years in airline management, Derek thought, and I've never seen someone destroy themselves this thoroughly on camera. Isaiah's phone buzzed with an urgent message from Elena Santos. Isaiah, this is exceeding all projections. Media outlets are picking up the story in real time. Congressional offices are monitoring. FAA has opened a preliminary investigation. Are you ready for full identity revelation? Isaiah looked around the cabin. At Madison, whose entitled worldview was colliding with consequences she'd never imagined. At the witnesses documenting systematic discrimination. At the airline staff learning that their assumptions had legal and professional repercussions. Ms. Pierce, Isaiah said, quietly, speaking for the first time since her explicit racism had emerged. You've just demonstrated exactly why systematic bias monitoring is necessary. Your assumptions about who belongs where aren't personal opinions. They're discriminatory beliefs that affect how you treat other people. Madison looked at him with a mixture of fear and defiance. Who are you to lecture me? You don't know anything about me or my life. Isaiah's slight smile carried no warmth. Actually, Ms. Pierce, I know quite a lot about you now. Your live stream displays, your social media handles, your business partnerships are public information, and your behavior today has been comprehensively documented by multiple professional witnesses. He paused, letting that sink in. But more importantly, after today, a lot of other people are going to know about you too. And they're going to know exactly what kind of person you choose to be when you think you have power over someone else. Tyler's live stream had reached 45,000 viewers and was still climbing exponentially. Screenshots of Madison's worst moments were being shared across every social platform. The hashtags Madison1A Flight 284 and reverse discrimination were all trending nationally. News outlets were beginning to monitor the situation. Social media managers at major brands were taking notes. Legal teams were analyzing potential liability exposure. And Isaiah Bennett was preparing to reveal exactly who he was and what this flight had really been designed to accomplish. The racial dynamic hadn't just exploded. It had been comprehensively documented, legally analyzed, and broadcast to tens of thousands of people in real time. Phase 3 was complete. Phase 4 was about to begin. and Madison Pierce had no idea that her problems were just getting started. While Madison Pierce was experiencing real-time social media destruction in Seat 1B, Elena Santos was coordinating from her Chicago command center what had become the most sophisticated bias documentation and response operation in corporate history. The technology behind Equity Protocol Delta 7 represented 3 years of development, but more importantly, it was designed specifically for moments when discrimination needed immediate, comprehensive, and legally unassailable documentation. Elena's screens displayed cascading data that most people would never see, but which painted a complete picture of systematic discrimination being addressed in real time. Flight 284, Comprehensive Threat Analysis, Audio Processing, complete. Discriminatory phrases, detected 23 instances. Bias indicators, confirmed. Reverse discrimination doesn't belong, you people. Stress analysis. Madison Pierce, showing 94% emotional volatility. Calm maintenance. Isaiah Bennett, consistent throughout. Video analysis, active. Recording sources. 16. Independent streams. Identified. Facial recognition. Clear. Emotional progression. Documented. Body language assessment. No aggressive posturing from complainant. Equipment. Validation. Professional social media setup. Confirmed. Social media monitoring. TikTok. Primary stream 47,000 concurrent viewers. Cross-platform sharing. 89% acceleration rate. Platform sentiment. 91%. Negative toward discriminatory behavior. Trend analysis. Flight 284. Approaching national trending status. Witness credibility. Matrix doctor. Angela Morrison. Medical professional. Impeccable record. Elena Vasquez. Immigration attorney. Civil rights experience. Tyler Brooks. Student journalist. Comprehensive documentation. 18+ additional passengers. Corroborating testimonies logged. But Elena's secondary monitor displayed something even more significant. The systematic response capability that separated Equity Protocol from simple documentation. Corporate Intervention Network. Activated. Skyline Airways. Ownership. 31%. Equity stake. Isaiah Bennett. Federal compliance triggers. FAA DOT. EEOC notifications. Sent media coordination. CNN, MSNBC. Major outlets alerted legal framework. Class action documentation. Initiated. Industry network. Partner airlines. Monitoring for policy coordination. Real-time market impact. Skyle stock. Down 18% in 90 minutes. Volume spike, 340%. Competitive positioning. Other airlines. Announcing policy reviews. Insurance implications. Liability. Coverage assessments. Triggered. Investment analysis. ESG compliance ratings under review. Back on flight 284. Isaiah's phone displayed the executive-level interface that no other passenger in aviation history had possessed. Nexus Executive Command. Phase 4. Ready evidence package. Status, comprehensive. Explicit bias. Language captured and verified. Employee enabling behavior. Documented. Multiple professional witness statements. Social media. Amplification. Achieving target metrics. Federal compliance violations confirmed. Corporate liability exposure maximized. Individual consequence options. Passenger conduct. Violation. Federal complaint. Filing. Employee performance. Action. Immediate termination authority. Corporate escalation. Board-level policy. Implementation. Media response. National coverage. Coordination. Legal action. Civil rights lawsuit. Preparation. Warning. Phase 4. Actions will have permanent consequences. Authorization required for identity revelation. Ready. Isaiah looked around the cabin one more time before activating the sequence that would change everything. Dr. Morrison was watching him with growing recognition. She'd heard him speak at medical conferences about bias detection technology. Elena Vasquez was researching him on her phone, her legal mind connecting dots between his calm authority and the systematic way this situation was developing. And Tyler's live stream had become the primary news source for what was rapidly becoming a national story. Ladies and gentlemen, Isaiah said, his voice carrying clearly through the first-class cabin, with an authority that made everyone pause mid-conversation. I apologize for the disruption to your travel plans today. Tyler's chat went wild. He's about to reveal something big. This man's energy shifted completely. Plot twist incoming. I can feel it. Why does he sound like he's in charge now? My name is Isaiah Bennett. I'm the founder and CEO of Nexus Digital Solutions. The cabin went silent, except for the hum of engines and the distant sound of Tyler's phone notifications exploding. Elena Vasquez's research had just pulled up Isaiah's Forbes profile. Dr. Morrison's medical conference memory was clicking into place. Even Madison, in her panic, was starting to understand that she'd made a catastrophic miscalculation. We specialize in identifying and addressing institutional bias through comprehensive technology monitoring and immediate accountability systems. Isaiah continued, his voice measured and professional, despite the magnitude of what he was revealing. Derek Hamilton's face had gone from concerned to ashen as the implications became clear. Marcus Webb was re-evaluating everything he thought he understood about this situation. 2 years ago, Nexus Digital acquired a 31% equity stake in Skyline Airways as part of our initiative to address systematic discrimination in the transportation industry. Madison looked like she might be physically sick. This flight was selected for comprehensive monitoring under what we call Equity Protocol Delta 7. Every interaction, every decision, every choice made by passengers and crew has been recorded, analyzed, and documented for legal and regulatory review. Elena Santos's voice came through Isaiah's earpiece. Isaiah media pickup is exceeding projections. CNN has assigned a breaking news team. Stock market volatility is triggering circuit breakers. Congressional Commerce Committee staff are requesting immediate briefings. You're about to make history. Isaiah's response was calm. Phase 4 authorized. Begin full media coordination and systematic response implementation. Tyler nearly dropped his phone hearing his live stream referenced by the CEO. His viewer count had passed 60,000 and was climbing exponentially as people shared the feed across every social platform. But the most sophisticated aspect of the technology wasn't its documentation capability. It was the response system. Within seconds of Isaiah's authorization, coordinated actions began implementing across multiple systems. Federal agencies received comprehensive bias documentation packages. Media outlets received verified evidence packages with legal analysis. Corporate partnerships activated policy change protocols. Legal teams initiated civil rights violation procedures. Stock market algorithms triggered volatility responses based on discrimination liability. The purpose of this system, Isaiah concluded, wasn't to entrap anyone. It was to document how discrimination actually occurs in institutional settings with comprehensive accountability that traditional complaint processes have never been able to provide. Madison Pierce had unknowingly become the catalyst for the most comprehensive corporate bias intervention in American business history. The technology trap hadn't just caught individual bad actors. It had captured an entire system of institutional discrimination and activated immediate systematic responses that would reshape how bias was addressed across multiple industries. And it was all being broadcast live to tens of thousands of people who were witnessing corporate accountability happen in real time. The revelation that Isaiah Bennett owned 31% of Skyline Airways sent his mind racing back through the events that had led him to this seat, this moment, this systematic intervention that had been decades in the making. But it wasn't the business success that had driven him here. It was the accumulation of humiliations, both small and large, that had taught him discrimination could only be addressed through power preparation and comprehensive accountability. The foundational memory came rushing back with painful clarity. 8 years old, standing with his parents in the lobby of Morrison Funeral Home on Chicago's South Side. They were dressed in their Sunday finest for his grandmother's memorial service, his father in his only suit, his mother in the black dress she wore to church, young Isaiah in clothes that had been pressed and prepared with the kind of care that poor families reserve for the most important occasions. But the funeral director had looked at them with barely concealed skepticism and said, "Are you sure you're in the right place? The other service is downstairs." Even as a child, Isaiah had understood the weight of those pauses, the calculation behind the assumption that this black family, no matter how well dressed or prepared, probably belonged in the basement rather than the main chapel. His parents had stood there with quiet dignity, while a stranger questioned their right to mourn their matriarch in the same space as everyone else. That moment had planted something deep in his psyche. Not just anger, though that was there, but systematic determination. A burning resolve that one day he would have enough power to ensure no other child experienced that particular flavor of institutional humiliation. The path from that funeral home to seat 1A had been built on strategic decisions that most people would never understand. Stanford computer science, with a focus on algorithmic bias detection. Harvard MBA, studying corporate governance and equity stakeholder activism. His senior thesis, using market mechanics to force institutional change. A paper his advisor had dismissed as academically interesting, but practically impossible to implement. The advisor had been spectacularly wrong, but it was the personal catalysts that had shaped Isaiah's approach to systematic change. The incident at 16 when hotel security had questioned his right to use the pool, despite holding a valid room key. The job interview at 24 when the hiring manager had expressed surprise at his qualifications and suggested he might be more comfortable in a different division. The business dinner at 30 when a client had assumed he was the restaurant's sommelier, despite being introduced as the company founder. Each incident had taught him something crucial. Individual confrontation changed. Nothing but systematic accountability could change everything. The specific moment that had led him to target airlines had occurred 18 months earlier during a business trip to Seattle. Isaiah was flying first class to deliver a keynote speech on bias detection technology, dressed in a tailored suit, carrying all appropriate documentation. But the gate agent had insisted on double-checking his ticket multiple times while waving through white passengers without verification. Sometimes the system glitches with these premium bookings. She'd explained, her tone carrying the unmistakable implication that someone like Isaiah wouldn't normally purchase first-class seating. When he'd finally boarded the flight, attendant had suggested he might be more comfortable in the economy section, despite his boarding pass clearly showing 2A and his platinum frequent flyer status. During the pre-flight announcement, the pilot had personally welcomed 3 other first-class passengers by name, all white, while making no mention of Isaiah, despite his higher airline status. That flight had crystallized everything. Isaiah realized that all the algorithm development and bias detection technology in the world couldn't address discrimination that was embedded in human behavior and institutional culture. The only way to create real change was to document bias comprehensively with unassailable evidence and immediate consequences that made discrimination economically unsustainable. So he'd spent 18 months acquiring strategic equity positions in major airlines. Not enough to control them, but enough to access their systems and implement comprehensive monitoring protocols. He'd built partnerships with federal compliance agencies, media organizations, and civil rights legal teams. He'd developed response capabilities that could activate within minutes of discrimination being documented. Most importantly, he'd prepared himself psychologically for the personal cost of deliberately subjecting himself to discriminatory treatment. Working with Dr. Sarah Williams, a therapist who specialized in racial trauma and systematic activism, Isaiah had processed the emotional complexity of using his own experiences of bias as evidence for institutional change. It's going to hurt every time Dr. Williams had warned him during their preparation sessions. Even knowing you have the power to respond, being treated as less than human affects you on a cellular level. But you're not just enduring discrimination. You're transforming it into systematic accountability that protects millions of other people. She'd been right about the pain. Hearing Madison say he probably doesn't belong in first class had triggered every similar moment from childhood through adulthood. The funeral director, who'd assumed they were in the wrong place. The hotel security guard, who'd questioned his right to use facilities his family had paid for. The conference organizer, who'd asked if he was sure he was supposed to be at the executive reception. But this time was different. This time, Isaiah wasn't a powerless child or a junior employee who had to swallow his dignity to protect his career. This time, he had resources, legal backing, comprehensive documentation systems, and most importantly, the ability to ensure that this moment of discrimination would catalyze systematic changes that protected other people from experiencing what he'd experienced. His phone buzzed with a message from Zara, who was watching Tyler's live stream from her Stanford dormitory. "Dad, my entire floor is watching this. My roommate is crying. You're not just changing airlines. You're showing people that discrimination doesn't have to be endured silently anymore." Isaiah's response was brief, but weighted with 26 years of preparation. "Baby girl, this is what happens when personal trauma becomes systematic accountability. No other child is going to experience what I experienced in that funeral home, because now discrimination has consequences that match its impact." Elena Santos's voice came through his earpiece with tactical updates. Isaiah's federal response is exceeding all projections. The FAA is announcing immediate policy reviews. Congressional Commerce Committee wants emergency hearings. International airlines are requesting consultations on implementing similar systems. You've just changed an entire industry. But for Isaiah, the systematic changes were secondary to the personal vindication. 26 years after being told he didn't belong in his grandmother's memorial service, he was sitting in seat 1A of Flight 284, having used that moment of childhood humiliation as the foundation for creating accountability systems that would protect millions of people from similar experiences. The funeral home director, who'd questioned his family's right to mourn with dignity, had unknowingly catalyzed the development of technology that would make institutional discrimination visible, costly, and ultimately unsustainable across multiple industries. Isaiah Bennett had transformed personal trauma into systematic justice, one carefully documented intervention at a time. While Isaiah Bennett processed the vindication of 26 years of strategic preparation, Madison Pierce was experiencing the most devastating hours of her 28 years of existence. Slumped in seat 1B, the seat she should have occupied from the beginning, she was watching her entire identity disintegrate in real time. But the destruction wasn't just professional. It was forcing her to confront who she had become and how she had gotten there. The girl from Columbus, Ohio, hadn't started life as an entitled influencer. Madison Elizabeth Pierce had grown up in a middle-class household where her father Dave sold insurance and her mother Linda worked as a dental hygienist. They'd provided a comfortable life, but Madison had always been acutely aware of what they couldn't provide: the designer clothes, exotic vacations, and effortless luxury that some of her high school classmates took for granted. At Ohio State University, studying communications with dreams of broadcast journalism. Madison had been overwhelmed by the wealth and sophistication of students from East Coast families. Girls who spoke casually about family vacation homes in Martha's Vineyard, who wore designer clothes like uniforms, who never seemed to worry about student loans or work-study jobs. She remembered the exact moment her worldview had shifted. Sophomore year spring break. Her roommate Jessica was going to Cabo with friends, posting about it constantly, while Madison was heading home to Columbus to work at her mother's dental office to help pay for textbooks. "Maybe next year you can come with us," Jessica had said with casual kindness that somehow felt like pity. "I mean, if you save up enough." That night, Madison had created her first Instagram post, designed to suggest wealth she didn't possess. A photo of her childhood bedroom, rearranged to look like a boutique hotel, with strategic angles and borrowed jewelry, creating an illusion of luxury lifestyle. The likes and comments had been intoxicating. Goals. Living your best life. Teach me your ways. Someone thought her life was worth envying. Someone wanted to be her. Social media had offered an escape route from the middle-class limitations that had always made her feel excluded. By carefully curating her image, strategic camera angles borrowed designer pieces, locations that suggested wealth she didn't possess. Madison had begun building an online persona that reflected who she wanted to be rather than who she was. The first brand partnership had been transformative. A skincare company paid her $200 to promote their products to her then modest following of 50,000. It wasn't just the money. It was the validation. Someone thought her lifestyle was worth paying to be associated with. But as her following grew, so did the pressure to maintain the illusion. Every photo had to suggest effortless wealth. Every story had to reinforce her position as someone who belonged in exclusive spaces. First-class flights weren't just travel. They were content opportunities that justified her claims to luxury. The girl who had once felt intimidated by wealth had become someone who aggressively claimed luxury as her birthright. Now, watching her Instagram follower count plummet, while brand partnerships disappeared in real time, Madison was being forced to confront the devastating irony of her situation. In trying to claim space in first-class cabins and five-star hotels and exclusive events, she had become the very kind of person who'd once made her feel excluded. She had internalized the message that worth was determined by appearance, by accessories, by the ability to claim premium spaces. When Isaiah Bennett had appeared beside her seat, dressed casually and carrying a simple backpack, Madison's deepest insecurities had been triggered. His presence threatened the carefully constructed performance that had become her identity. If someone who didn't look like he belonged in first class was allowed to sit there, what did that say about her own claims to the space? It was easier to exclude him than examine herself. Her phone was buzzing with increasingly desperate messages. Her business manager, Madison, "This is catastrophic. Every brand partnership is terminated. I'm getting calls from lawyers about contract violations due to reputation damage clauses." Her publicist, "I can't fix this. The footage is everywhere. You need crisis management specialists, not PR." Her mother, Madison, "Honey, we're seeing things online. What happened? Are you okay? Call us." How could she explain to her parents, who had raised her to treat everyone with respect, that their daughter had become someone who made assumptions about people based on their appearance? That the success they'd been so proud of was built on a performance that had led her to deny someone else's basic dignity? The most devastating realization was that she had become exactly what she had once envied and resented: someone who used perceived social status to exclude others from spaces they had legitimate claims to. Madison Pierce, the girl who had once felt intimidated by first-class passengers, had become someone who believed her presence in first class was more legitimate than someone else's boarding pass. The insecurity that had driven her to perform wealth and status had transformed her into someone who weaponized assumptions about who belonged where. Now she was discovering what happened when the performance ended and the exclusion turned back on her. Dr. Angela Morrison sat in seat 2C, her medical journal forgotten as she processed her role in what was rapidly becoming a historic moment of corporate accountability. At 54, she'd spent 3 decades navigating predominantly white professional spaces, but she'd never seen discrimination documented and addressed as comprehensively as Isaiah Bennett had just demonstrated. The decision to speak up hadn't been calculated. It had been instinctive. 30 years of experiencing similar bias in medical settings had given her an immediate recognition of what was happening and a moral obligation to intervene. But now, watching Isaiah reveal the systematic planning behind this moment, Dr. Morrison realized her choice to break the silence had contributed to something much larger than a single passenger dispute. Her phone was buzzing with messages from colleagues who were following the story online. Dr. Patricia Williams, AMA President, Angela Y. just watched the footage. Your intervention was exactly the kind of professional leadership we need. Can we discuss adapting Bennett's technology for healthcare discrimination monitoring? Dr. Keisha Morrison Williams, her daughter Mom. My entire residency program just watched this during break. My attending said, that's what it looks like when someone with authority uses it for justice. I'm so proud of you. Dr. Morrison realized that her decision to speak up hadn't just supported Isaiah in the moment. It had provided a model for how medical professionals could address bias in healthcare settings. As someone who'd spent years enduring microaggressions to avoid being labeled difficult, she had finally found a situation where silence would have been complicity. Her phone rang with a call from Dr. Patricia Williams. Angela, we've been analyzing the Flight 284 incident. We want to discuss implementing bias monitoring in hospital systems. Would you be interested in leading that initiative? 30 years of experiencing discrimination in medical settings, Dr. Morrison thought. And now, I might have the chance to prevent other doctors and patients from going through the same thing. Elena Vasquez was having her own realization about the broader implications of what she'd witnessed and documented. As an immigration attorney who'd spent her career fighting for people whose right to belong was constantly questioned, she recognized the revolutionary potential of Isaiah's systematic approach to addressing discrimination. Her legal training had compelled her to document everything, but she hadn't anticipated that her real-time analysis would become evidence in what was already being called a landmark civil rights intervention. Her 3 pages of detailed notes captured not just what had happened, but how each decision had been made and why. Her law partner was already calling Elena the ACLU, wants to discuss using your documentation as a template for real-time civil rights evidence collection. They're talking about developing legal frameworks that use comprehensive bias monitoring to address discrimination before it becomes institutionalized. Elena looked at her notes and realized she had documented something unprecedented: systematic discrimination being identified, challenged, and addressed in real time with immediate consequences and comprehensive accountability. Her immigration law background had taught her to recognize when people's fundamental rights were under attack, and Madison's assumptions about who belonged in first class represented the same kind of bias that affected her client's right to belong in America. Tyler Brooks was processing the most dramatic career shift imaginable. At 19, he'd walked onto Flight 284 as a college sophomore with a modest TikTok following. He was walking off as the primary documentarian of what was already being called the most comprehensive real-time civil rights intervention in decades. His phone was exploding with opportunities that would have seemed impossible hours earlier. CNN Tyler, we want to offer you a correspondent position focusing on civil rights documentation. Your real-time journalism captured something unprecedented. His journalism professor, Tyler, you've documented a story that will change how discrimination is addressed across multiple industries. This is Pulitzer-level work. Netflix. We're interested in developing a documentary series about technology-enabled civil rights activism. Would you be interested in participating? But Tyler was also grappling with the ethical complexity of what he'd captured. His live stream had provided crucial evidence of discrimination, but it had also broadcast Madison's destruction to hundreds of thousands of people in real time. When does documentation serve justice? And when does it become digital vigilantism? Tyler wondered. His journalism training had taught him to consider the broader implications of his work, and Madison's career collapse was happening because of footage he had captured and broadcast. His professor's text provided some guidance. Tyler, the difference between journalism and exploitation is purpose and context. You documented systematic discrimination being addressed through comprehensive accountability. That serves the public interest and creates educational value that extends far beyond individual consequences. Jessica Chen was experiencing the most complex reckoning of all the secondary characters. As the flight attendant who had initially enabled the discrimination by asking Isaiah to step aside, she was confronting her own unconscious biases and the institutional pressures that had led her to make discriminatory choices despite her good intentions. Her union representative had called during the flight. Jessica, we've reviewed the footage. The airline will want to terminate you, but we're arguing for rehabilitation rather than punishment. Your immediate acknowledgement of the mistake and request for additional training shows exactly the kind of response that can create cultural change. Jessica knew her aviation career would forever be marked by this incident. Every future job application would require explaining her role in a widely publicized discrimination case. But she also understood that her willingness to acknowledge her mistake and seek improvement could contribute to preventing similar incidents. The hardest part was recognizing that she had thought she was being professional. She'd prioritized what she believed was customer satisfaction over basic fairness, and she hadn't realized she was making a discriminatory choice until the consequences made it impossible to ignore. Each of the secondary characters was discovering that their individual choices during those crucial moments had contributed to a historical intervention that would reshape how discrimination was identified, documented, and addressed across multiple industries. They had all become part of a story larger than themselves, some as examples of moral courage, others as cautionary tales about unconscious bias, but all as witnesses to the power of comprehensive accountability to create systematic change. Tyler Brooks's TikTok live stream had achieved something that even seasoned journalists struggled to accomplish. It had become the primary news source for a story that was reshaping in real time as viewers watched. His count had surged past 75,000 concurrent watchers, with thousands more joining every minute as the footage spread across every social media platform. The moment that changed everything came from the comments section itself. A viewer posted a link that stopped the frantic chat scrolling. "Wait, is that Isaiah Bennett, CEO, Nexus Digital Forbes billionaire list?" Within minutes, the live stream chat transformed into a crowdsourced investigation. Screenshots from Isaiah's business profiles flooded the comments. TechCrunch articles about Nexus Digital Solutions' $3.2 billion valuation. Harvard Business Review features on technology leaders reshaping corporate ethics. Congressional testimony footage where Isaiah discussed using equity investments to force institutional change. Comments exploding. "Y'all, he's a billionaire CEO. She literally discriminated against someone who could buy the whole airline. The most expensive mistake in Karen history. This man owns 31% of Skyline Airways. Madison is about to learn today." Dr. Morrison was the first person in the cabin to make the connection. Her medical background had exposed her to Isaiah's work on healthcare bias detection. She'd seen him present at Stanford Medical's Diversity Summit about using artificial intelligence to identify treatment disparities. "Mr. Bennett," she said, her voice cutting through the cabin murmur with professional authority, "you developed the patient treatment monitoring system that Johns Hopkins is piloting, didn't you?" Isaiah looked at her with recognition and a slight smile. I did, Dr. Morrison. You asked an excellent question during the Q&A about emergency room triage protocols and how unconscious bias affects critical care decisions. The recognition sent a visible ripple through the cabin. If Dr. Morrison knew Isaiah from professional medical conferences, if he was developing bias detection systems for major hospitals, then he wasn't just any passenger dealing with airline discrimination. Elena Vasquez was frantically searching on her phone, her legal mind connecting dots at lightning speed. What she found made her breath catch. Nexus Digital Solutions, founder and CEO, annual revenue, $2.8 billion, specialization, institutional bias detection, and corporate accountability. Recent acquisitions, significant equity stakes in transportation companies as part of systematic bias prevention initiative, board positions, FAA Advisory Committee, Civil Rights Commission, technology consultant, net worth, $3.2 billion. Elena looked up from her phone directly at Isaiah, her legal training helping her understand the implications. You don't just study discrimination. You own part of this airline. It wasn't a question. It was a statement of realization that changed everything. Derek Hamilton, who had been trying to manage what he thought was a difficult passenger situation, felt reality shifting beneath his feet. I'm sorry. What did you just say? Tyler's live stream absolutely exploded. He owns the airline. Derek is about to get fired in real time. This is the best plot twist in internet history. Madison discriminated against her own boss. The CEO is testing his own company. The cabin energy shifted dramatically. Passengers who had been trying to avoid the confrontation were now leaning forward, recognizing they were witnessing something unprecedented. Business travelers were pulling up Isaiah's professional profiles on their phones. The elderly woman in 4A whispered to her husband, "He's that man from the news who fixes companies that discriminate." Madison Pierce, who had been frantically trying to manage her collapsing social media empire, froze as she began to comprehend the magnitude of her mistake. She hadn't just been racist toward a random black passenger. She had been racist towards someone with the power to destroy her career and the resources to ensure there were systematic consequences. Her business manager was calling nonstop. Her publicist had sent a text that simply read, "Madison, I can't help you. This is beyond crisis management. You need a lawyer." But it was the notification from her bank that made Madison's hands shake uncontrollably. "Your business account has been flagged for review due to reputational risk factors that may affect your income stream and creditworthiness." Derek Hamilton was experiencing his own moment of professional terror. The passenger he'd been trying to remove from the aircraft was a major shareholder in the airline, someone with direct access to the board of directors, someone whose equity stake gave him voting rights on executive personnel decisions. "My 15-year career is over," Derek realized with sick certainty. "I just tried to force a 31% owner of the company to give up his seat because I assumed a white influencer was more valuable than actual airline policies." Marcus Webb, the security officer, was rapidly reassessing everything through the lens of new information. The disruptive passenger was actually someone with more corporate authority than the pilot. The victim of harassment was someone who had engaged in explicit discrimination against a person with unprecedented power to respond. In her Chicago command center, Elena Santos was monitoring social media analytics that showed the story reaching viral saturation levels that broke platform records. Real-time social media impact analysis. TikTok. Isaiah Bennett, trending #1 globally. 2.3 M mentions Twitter. Flight 284, trending in 31 countries. 890K posts. Instagram. Madison Pierce mentioned. 7 million times 94% negative YouTube reaction videos uploading every 15 seconds. LinkedIn business professionals sharing story in professional contexts. Reddit, 12+ subreddits discussing front page across platforms. Traditional media pickup, CNN. Breaking news alert, assigned crew en route to Miami. MSNBC, reshaping evening programming to cover story. Fox Business, stock market implications being analyzed. BBC international coverage due to civil rights technology implications. Dr. Morrison stood from her seat, recognizing the historical significance of what was unfolding. Her voice carried the authority of someone who understood that individual moments of moral courage could catalyze systematic change. Mr. Bennett, as someone who has experienced healthcare discrimination personally, I want to thank you for creating accountability where none existed before. But I need to ask, what happens next? How do you ensure this leads to lasting systematic change, rather than just individual consequences? Isaiah's response revealed the depth of strategic planning that had gone into this moment. Dr. Morrison, individual consequences don't change systems. They just create martyrs and resentment. What changes systems is comprehensive monitoring, transparent accountability, and immediate economic consequences that make discrimination more expensive than fair treatment. He held up his phone, showing enough of the professional interface to demonstrate he had access to systems none of the other passengers possessed. What you're witnessing now is the activation of monitoring protocols that will be implemented across not just Skyline Airways, but every airline where Nexus Digital has partnership agreements. Elena Vasquez looked up from her legal notes, her attorney's mind grasping the revolutionary implications. Are you talking about industry-wide bias, monitoring as standard business practice? I'm talking about making discrimination impossible to hide and financially unsustainable. Isaiah replied, his voice carrying the quiet authority of someone who had spent years building systems that could reshape entire industries. Every passenger interaction, every seating decision, every staff escalation will be analyzed for patterns that indicate bias. Airlines that demonstrate discriminatory behavior will face immediate consequences. Federal investigations, stock price impacts, regulatory sanctions, and comprehensive public accountability. Tyler's camera was capturing the exact moment when everyone in the cabin realized they weren't just witnessing a passenger dispute gone wrong. They were witnessing the implementation of a systematic intervention that had been planned for months, with resources and legal backing that could transform an entire industry. Madison Pierce looked around, desperately searching for someone who might still see her as the victim, rather than the perpetrator. But the expressions surrounding her ranged from professional fascination with Isaiah's systematic approach to barely concealed disgust at her discriminatory behavior. Her entire worldview was being forced to recalibrate in real time. The man she had dismissed as someone who probably doesn't belong in first class was actually someone with more legitimate claim to every seat on the aircraft than anyone else present. The assumptions that had driven her behavior weren't just wrong. They were catastrophically, career-endingly, life-alteringly wrong. Derek Hamilton made one last desperate attempt at damage control. Mr. Bennett, if there are specific concerns about our customer service protocols, surely there are established corporate channels for addressing Isaiah's look, stopped him mid-sentence. The quiet authority in that gaze carried the weight of someone who had tried established channels and found them inadequate. Mr. Hamilton, established corporate channels are how 127 discrimination complaints got buried without meaningful response over the past 2 years. Established corporate channels are how passengers continue to experience bias that affects their dignity, safety, and civil rights. He gestured toward Madison, who was staring at her phone in horrified fascination as her social media empire continued its real-time collapse. Established corporate channels are how someone can make explicitly racist comments on an aircraft and expect airline staff to enable her behavior rather than examine basic evidence. The weight of that statement settled over the cabin like a heavy blanket. Every choice that had been made. Jessica's decision to ask Isaiah to step aside, Derek's assumption that Madison was the more valuable customer, Marcus's initial hesitation to check basic documentation, had been based on biases that were now being systematically exposed and addressed. Tyler's livestream chat was moving too fast for human comprehension, but the sentiment was overwhelmingly clear. This is what real accountability looks like. He didn't just document discrimination. He built systems to prevent it. Madison picked the wrong person to be racist to. This is going to change everything about how companies handle bias. Elena Santos's voice came through Isaiah's earpiece, with updates that confirmed the national scope of what was unfolding. Isaiah, we're receiving calls from congressional offices requesting emergency briefings. The FAA has opened a formal investigation. Stock market analysts are calling this the most comprehensive corporate bias intervention in business history. International airlines are requesting consultations on implementing similar systems. Isaiah's phone displayed a notification that only he could see. Phase 4, complete. Identity. Revelation. Successful. Media saturation. 97% target achievement. Witness documentation. Comprehensive coverage confirmed. Corporate liability. Maximum exposure. Achieved. Federal oversight. All triggers activated. Phase 5. Authorization available. Systematic consequences. Implementation. Individual accountability. Measures. Industry transformation. Protocols. Isaiah looked around the cabin one final time before activating Phase 5. At Madison, whose entitled world view was colliding with unavoidable consequences. At Derek and Jessica, who were learning that unconscious bias had professional repercussions. At Dr. Morrison and Elena Vasquez, who had demonstrated that moral courage could contribute to systematic change. At Tyler, whose journalistic instincts had provided crucial documentation for historic accountability. 26 years after being told he didn't belong at his grandmother's funeral, Isaiah Bennett was implementing systematic changes that would ensure millions of other people never experienced similar discrimination. He pressed the button that would activate Phase 5, systematic consequences. In the executive suite of Skyline Airways headquarters, 47 floors above downtown Chicago, CEO Patricia Valdez was experiencing the kind of institutional crisis that no amount of corporate disaster training could adequately prepare executives to handle. Her Tuesday morning quarterly review had devolved into comprehensive emergency management as every screen in the boardroom displayed the catastrophic real-time impact of Flight 284. The crisis had escalated beyond typical PR disasters into something that threatened the company's fundamental viability. Patricia's assistant had interrupted the financial meeting at 11:15 a.m. with barely controlled panic. "Ma'am, we have a code red situation that's trending globally. One of our flights has become the center of a discrimination scandal involving complications with a major shareholder who apparently owns 31% of our company." The wall-mounted screens now displayed Tyler Brooks's TikTok live stream, which had become the primary news source for what business analysts were already calling the most comprehensive real-time documentation of corporate bias, enabling in aviation history. Patricia watched in growing horror as Isaiah Bennett calmly explained to a cabin full of passengers and 80,000-plus online viewers that he had systematically tested Skyline's discrimination policies and found them catastrophically inadequate. Jesus Christ on a bicycle, muttered CFO Robert Kim, his tablet, showing real-time market data that painted a devastating picture. How did we not know he was conducting systematic bias testing? Our own shareholder has been planning this intervention for months. Chief Operations Officer Linda Martinez was monitoring social media sentiment, her face growing paler with each refresh. Stock price has fallen 31% in 90 minutes. That's $2.7 billion in market value gone. Trading volume is 340% above normal. The hashtag Skyline Shame is trending #1 in 23 countries. Patricia's phone was exploding with calls that represented every possible nightmare scenario, simultaneously board members demanding immediate explanations, federal regulators scheduling emergency meetings, institutional investors questioning their positions, and news outlets seeking statements about systematic discrimination enabling. "Get me our legal team immediately," Patricia ordered, her voice tight with controlled panic that was becoming less controlled by the minute. "And someone find out everything we can about this equity protocol system. How long has Bennett been positioning himself to have oversight authority over our operations?" Legal counsel James Morrison was already speed-reading through Nexus Digital's corporate filings, his expression growing grimmer with each page. "Patricia, this wasn't opportunistic activism. Bennett has been systematically building toward this moment for years. His equity acquisitions follow a pattern designed to create accountability systems across the entire transportation industry." The revelation screen displayed a strategic map that revealed the true scope of Isaiah's planning. Nexus Digital Transportation Sector, Strategy, Completed Acquisitions. Skyline, Airways, 31%, Equity Stake, 2022-2023. Primary Testing Ground for Comprehensive Bias Monitoring. Employee Training Protocols, developed and ready for implementation. Federal Compliance Frameworks, established and approved. United Express, 18%, Equity Stake, 2023, Bias. Detection Systems implemented, Q3, 2023, with remarkable results. Employee discrimination incidents decreased, 71%. Customer satisfaction among minority passengers increased, 39%. Delta connection, 12%. Equity stake, with expansion options. Voluntary monitoring protocols already being implemented. Management proactively requesting expanded partnership agreements. Board approval process expedited due to Skyline incident. Active negotiations. American Eagle partnership discussions accelerated to emergency status. Board calling emergency session for this afternoon. Requesting immediate comprehensive bias prevention agreements. Competitive pressure from early adopter success stories. Robert Kim was running financial projections that painted an increasingly catastrophic picture. Even if we could legally challenge his ownership stake, which we can't because all acquisitions were properly documented and cleared through regulatory channels, the immediate damage is potentially fatal to the company as currently structured. Patricia's secure line rang with the call she'd been dreading most, Senator Margaret Thompson, chair of the Commerce, Science, and Transportation Committee. "Patricia, I'm watching the Flight 284 situation develop in real time." The senator's voice carried the sharp edge of someone who had built her career on holding corporations accountable. "My staff is analyzing what appears to be systematic civil rights violations across your entire operational structure. The Commerce Committee is going to need comprehensive briefings, and we're going to need them within 24 hours. Patricia tried to maintain some semblance of corporate authority. "Senator, we're still gathering comprehensive information about this specific incident. The information is being live-streamed to half the world. Patricia, what I need to understand is what Skyline Airways is going to do to address what appears to be institutional discrimination that your management not only enabled, but actively defended." After ending the call that had essentially announced federal oversight of her company, Patricia looked around the table at her executive team. Successful corporate leaders who were all realizing their careers might be permanently damaged by middle management decisions on a single flight. Options. Patricia demanded, her voice carrying the desperation of someone watching 30 years of corporate success evaporating. "What are our realistic options here?" "James?" Morrison's response was brutally honest, extremely limited. and all of them involve complete capitulation to Bennett's systematic changes. The evidence of discrimination is overwhelming, public, and legally unassailable. We have employees who violated federal civil rights law on camera. We have a passenger making explicitly racist statements while our staff enabled her behavior. And we have comprehensive documentation of everything by someone who owns 31% of our company and specializes in bias detection technology. Can we challenge the monitoring systems as corporate espionage or privacy violations? Absolutely not, without opening ourselves to additional securities law violations and civil rights complaints. Bennett followed every legal protocol for equity acquisition and shareholder notification. His bias monitoring systems were implemented through partnership agreements that our own legal department reviewed and approved. Linda Martinez looked up from her crisis management dashboard with news that made the situation even more complex. Patricia, other airlines are already responding proactively. United issued a statement 45 minutes ago, announcing immediate expansion of bias training for all customer-facing employees. Delta is requesting emergency meetings with Nexus Digital to implement voluntary monitoring systems ahead of any regulatory requirements. American Eagle just announced they're accelerating partnership negotiations with Bennett's company. Patricia felt the full scope of the strategic bind they were facing. This wasn't just a crisis for Skyline Airways. This was an industry-wide transformation that was happening with or without their cooperation, and fighting it would leave them as the only major airline without comprehensive bias prevention while facing federal investigations and public boycotts. Robert Kim's financial analysis confirmed their impossible position. If we resist these changes, we'll be the only major carrier without systematic bias prevention, while facing ongoing federal investigations, class action lawsuits, and consumer boycotts. If we embrace the changes immediately and position ourselves as industry leaders in civil rights compliance, we might salvage our market position and demonstrate good faith cooperation with federal oversight. Patricia's phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number that carried the polite but unmistakable weight of someone negotiating from overwhelming strength. Ms. Valdez, this is Elena Santos, Corporate Liaison for Nexus Digital Solutions. Mr. Bennett would like to schedule a call to discuss immediate implementation of comprehensive bias prevention protocols across Skyline's operations. He has availability at your convenience and looks forward to partnering with your team on industry-leading civil rights compliance. The message was diplomatically phrased, but clear in its implications: cooperation or destruction. James Morrison was reviewing federal compliance regulations on his laptop, his expression showing the legal reality they faced. Patricia, we have approximately 90 minutes before this becomes a formal federal investigation with congressional oversight. The FAA is asking pointed questions. The Department of Transportation's Civil Rights Division is reviewing the incident footage. The EEOC is likely opening employment discrimination proceedings. And if we cooperate immediately with Bennett's systematic changes, we might avoid the worst federal oversight while demonstrating proactive compliance with civil rights regulations. His bias prevention systems could actually protect us from future liability while showing good faith cooperation with regulatory agencies. Patricia stared at the screens showing Tyler's live stream, where Isaiah Bennett was calmly explaining to thousands of viewers how systematic bias monitoring could prevent the discrimination they'd just witnessed. The man wasn't just exposing problems. He was offering comprehensive solutions that could transform the industry. Set up the emergency call with Bennett. Patricia decided, her voice carrying the weight of someone who had just accepted that her company would never operate the same way again. And clear my schedule for the rest of the week. We're about to learn how to run an airline according to someone who actually understands civil rights law and has the power to enforce it. As her assistant began coordinating what would be the most important call in Skyline Airways corporate history, Patricia Valdez realized that the next conversation would determine whether her company would be remembered as the airline that resisted accountability or embraced it as a competitive advantage. Either way, the transformation was happening. The only choice was whether they would lead it or be dragged through it by federal regulators and market forces. Back on Flight 284, Isaiah Bennett was preparing to demonstrate the full scope of systematic accountability that Patricia Valdez and her executive team were just beginning to understand. Standing in the aisle of first class with Tyler's live stream approaching 90,000 viewers and every passenger's complete attention, Isaiah activated the comprehensive response capabilities that represented 3 years of legal preparation and strategic positioning. His phone screen displayed executive override options that no other passenger in aviation history had possessed. Nexus Executive Command. Phase 5. Implementation. Systematic accountability measures. Immediate actions. Authorized. Employee performance review. Terminate. Derek Hamilton. Employee performance review. Suspend. Jessica Chen. Pending comprehensive retraining. Passenger conduct violation. Implement industry-wide travel ban. Corporate policy escalation. Board-level mandatory changes. Federal notification. Civil rights investigation. Coordination. Industry. Partner. Alert. Bias. Prevention. Protocol. Activation. Media. Response. Coordination. National coverage. Management. Estimated. Implementation. Time. 8 minutes. Warning. Actions will create permanent industry-wide consequences. Isaiah's finger moved across the screen with the precision of someone who had spent months planning for exactly this moment. But first, he wanted everyone in the cabin to understand they were witnessing the implementation of accountability systems that would extend far beyond this single flight. Ladies and gentlemen, Isaiah said, his voice carrying the quiet authority of someone who no longer needed to prove his legitimacy to anyone. What you've witnessed today represents the testing and activation of systematic bias prevention protocols. The question now is whether the consequences will match the severity of the discriminatory behavior. Tyler's live stream chat was moving faster than human comprehension could follow. He's about to end. Careers in real time. Justice happening live at 35,000 feet. Accountability with witnesses and receipts. This is what happens when racism meets consequences. Madison Pierce was experiencing complete professional and personal destruction as she watched her phone display the real-time collapse of everything she'd built. Her Instagram had lost over 200,000 followers in 3 hours. Every major brand partnership had been terminated. News outlets were preparing segments about her career implosion. But the notification that made her physically nauseous came from her apartment complex, Ms. Pierce, due to media attention affecting resident privacy and safety. We need to discuss your lease situation. Please contact management immediately. I might lose my home, Madison realized with sick clarity. This isn't just my career. This is my entire life. Derek Hamilton was experiencing his own professional apocalypse as his phone buzzed constantly with calls from corporate headquarters that he was terrified to answer. 15 years of airline management career advancement was about to end because he'd chosen assumptions over evidence for 10 crucial minutes. Jessica Chen approached Isaiah first, her voice shaking, but determined. Mr. Bennett, I've submitted formal requests for immediate bias training and ongoing supervision. I failed in my professional duties today, and I take complete responsibility for enabling discrimination through my choices. Isaiah looked at Jessica with an expression that was serious, but not unkind. Ms. Chen, accountability is the first step towards systematic change. Your willingness to acknowledge mistakes and actively seek improvement is exactly the kind of response that can transform institutional culture rather than just punishing individuals. Dr. Morrison, who had been observing with professional interest, asked the question that many passengers were wondering. Mr. Bennett, How do you ensure that individual consequences lead to broader institutional changes, rather than just creating scapegoats who take blame, while systems remain unchanged? Isaiah's response demonstrated the sophisticated framework that had guided equity protocol development. Dr. Morrison. That's the crucial distinction between punishment and accountability. Punishment focuses on individuals and often creates resentment that prevents cultural change. Accountability focuses on systems and creates learning opportunities that prevent future incidents while addressing root causes. He gestured toward Madison, who was hunched over her phone trying to manage her collapsing digital empire. Ms. Pierce's consequences are important because they demonstrate that discriminatory behavior has costs that match its impact on people's lives. But the more significant change is the comprehensive monitoring system that will prevent future passengers from experiencing what I experienced. Elena Vasquez looked up from her legal documentation, Mr. Bennett from a civil rights law perspective. How do you balance individual accountability with the broader goal of institutional reform? Three-tiered accountability. Ms. Vasquez. Isaiah replied with the precision of someone who had thought through every aspect of systematic change. Individual consequences for people who engage in discriminatory behavior. Institutional consequences for organizations that enable or ignore bias. And systematic consequences for industries that fail to address documented patterns of discrimination. Tyler Brooks, whose journalism instincts were in overdrive, asked the question many of his 90,000-plus viewers were posting in the chat. What happens to people who were discriminated against before systems like this existed? Is there any justice for historical incidents that were never properly documented? Isaiah's smile carried the weight of 26 years of strategic preparation. That's exactly what makes this systematic, rather than just reactive, Mr. Brooks. The comprehensive data we've collected through bias monitoring identifies patterns of historical discrimination that can be addressed through class action litigation and institutional remediation programs. Elena Santos's voice came through Isaiah's earpiece with updates that demonstrated the national scope of what was unfolding. Isaiah. We're receiving confirmations from federal agencies. The FAA has opened a formal civil rights investigation. The Department of Transportation is reviewing systematic issues across the industry. The Congressional Commerce Committee wants emergency hearings tomorrow. Isaiah nodded, then addressed the cabin again. What you're seeing implemented today will become the new accountability standard, not just for airlines, but for any industry where bias affects people's access to services they have legal rights to receive. Marcus Webb, who had been quietly processing the transformation of what he'd thought was routine passenger management, asked Mr. Bennett, what happens to the employees who enabled the discrimination? Are their careers over, or is there a path forward? Isaiah's response revealed both his systematic thinking and his understanding of human psychology. Officer Webb consequences should be proportional to both the harm caused and the willingness to change. Ms. Chen acknowledged her mistake immediately and requested additional training. That suggests rehabilitation potential. Mr. Hamilton chose to escalate discrimination rather than examine evidence, which suggests different consequences are appropriate. Derek Hamilton finally found his voice, though it came out barely above a whisper. Mr. Bennett, I was trying to manage what I thought was a customer service situation. I didn't realize the full implications. Mr. Hamilton. Isaiah interrupted gently but firmly. That's exactly the problem. You made decisions about passenger treatment based on assumptions rather than examining basic evidence like boarding passes. That's not customer service. That's discrimination disguised as policy. Isaiah's phone buzzed with notifications that appeared on his executive interface. Corporate Response Coordination complete. CEO, Patricia Valdez. Emergency Cooperation Meeting requested. Board of Directors. Emergency session scheduled for 2 p.m. EST Stock Market. Impact. SkyL down 34%. Market cap loss, $3.1 billion. Federal agencies, 4. Formal investigations opened. Industry response, 6 major airlines requesting immediate partnership meetings. Media coverage, breaking news status across all major networks. Individual consequences, ready for implementation. Authorization, confirmed for immediate activation. Isaiah looked around the cabin one final time, at Madison, whose world had been permanently altered by her own choices, at Derek and Jessica, who were learning that assumptions had career consequences, at Dr. Morrison, Elena, and Tyler, who had demonstrated that moral courage could contribute to systematic change. Ms. Pierce, Isaiah announced, his voice carrying throughout the cabin. You are permanently banned from all Skyline Airways flights, and that ban will be shared with every airline in our bias prevention partnership network. Madison looked up with red-rimmed eyes. You're banning me from flying. I'm ensuring that discriminatory behavior has consequences that match its impact on people's dignity and civil rights. Isaiah replied with calm finality. He turned to Derek Hamilton. Mr. Hamilton, your employment with Skyline Airways is terminated, effective immediately. Your access credentials have been revoked, and you'll be escorted from the aircraft when we land in Miami. Derek's face went white, but he nodded slowly, understanding that his career had ended the moment he chose assumptions over airline policy. Ms. Chen, you'll be suspended pending completion of comprehensive bias training and ongoing supervision. But your immediate acknowledgement of mistakes and commitment to improvement suggests your employment can continue with proper support systems. Jessica nodded, tears forming, but relief visible on her face. As Flight 284 began its final descent toward Miami, passengers began processing what they had witnessed. This hadn't been a random incident that spiraled out of control. This had been a carefully orchestrated intervention designed to create systematic change in an industry that had resisted accountability for generations. Tyler's livestream had become a historical record of how comprehensive documentation, immediate response, and strategic planning could transform discrimination from a hidden cost of doing business into a visible, expensive liability that organizations could no longer afford to ignore. Isaiah Bennett had used a single airplane seat to prove that systematic bias could be addressed through technology, legal preparation, and strategic positioning. Now that proof was being implemented across an entire industry, with implications that extended to healthcare, financial services, education, and government agencies. The seat that Madison Pierce had tried to claim through racist assumptions had become the foundation for a new standard of corporate accountability and human dignity that would protect millions of people from experiencing the discrimination that had shaped Isaiah's entire life. As Flight 284 continued its descent toward Miami, Elena Santos was coordinating from her Chicago command center what had evolved into the most sophisticated real-time corporate accountability operation in business history. The technology behind Equity Protocol Delta 7 represented the culmination of 3 years of development, but its true power lay not in its complexity, but in its precision and comprehensive scope. Elena's screens displayed data flows that painted a complete picture of systematic change happening across multiple industries simultaneously. Equity Protocol, Delta 7, Comprehensive Impact Analysis, Federal Coordination, Active, FAA, Investigation Case, Number 2024, CR 7841, Priority, Alpha Status, DOT, Civil Rights Division, Systematic Industry Review, Initiated, EEOC, Investigation, Employment Discrimination Proceedings, Opened Congressional Commerce Committee, Emergency Hearings, Scheduled 48 hours, White House Office of Public Engagement, Monitoring and Coordinating Response, Industry Transformation, Metrics, Skyline, Airways, Emergency Board Meeting, CEO, Requesting Immediate Cooperation, United Express. Comprehensive bias training implemented for 47,000 employees. Delta Connection. Voluntary monitoring systems. Activated across all routes. American Eagle partnership negotiations. Expedited to emergency status. Southwest Airlines. Proactive policy review and consultant requests. JetBlue. Federal compliance audit requested voluntarily. International response expanding. Air Canada. Emergency policy review. Technology demonstration requested British Airways. EU compliance officer coordinating with Nexus Systems. Lufthansa, German Transport Ministry. Requesting consultation. Qantas. Australian Human Rights Commission. Coordination initiated. Emirates UAE Civil Aviation Authority. Inquiring about systems. But the most remarkable aspect of the technology wasn't its scope. It was how it had been designed to create accountability while maintaining legal and ethical boundaries that could withstand federal scrutiny and international adoption. Elena opened a secure video connection with Isaiah, who was now seated comfortably in 1A, reviewing real-time impact reports while passengers around him processed the transformation they'd witnessed. Isaiah, the federal response is exceeding our most optimistic projections by 340%. Elena reported, her voice mixing professional excitement with the satisfaction of seeing years of preparation succeed beyond expectations. The FAA wants comprehensive briefings on bias monitoring technology within 12 hours. They're exploring mandating similar systems across all major carriers as a condition of federal operating licenses. Isaiah's response showed the long-term strategic vision that had guided the entire operation. The regulatory mandate was always the ultimate objective, Elena. When federal agencies see comprehensive discrimination documentation coupled with effective prevention systems, they recognize the potential for addressing civil rights violations before they require expensive litigation and enforcement actions. Congressional interest is particularly significant. Elena continued. Senator Thompson's Commerce Committee wants to understand how bias monitoring could be expanded beyond transportation, healthcare, financial services, housing, criminal justice, education. We're looking at potential federal legislation requiring bias monitoring across all major service industries, which accelerates our timeline for Phase 6 implementation. Isaiah replied, referring to the comprehensive expansion of bias monitoring that had been planned for gradual rollout over 2 years. What's the industry adoption status? Elena pulled up her secondary monitor. Faster than projected. United Express implemented emergency bias training for all customer-facing staff within 4 hours of your identity revelation. Delta Connection is implementing our monitoring protocols 2 months ahead of their contractual timeline. American Eagle has moved partnership negotiations from exploratory to emergency implementation status. The beauty of Isaiah's systematic approach was becoming clear to industry observers worldwide. Rather than fighting discrimination through traditional complaint processes that took years and often failed to create meaningful change, he'd created real-time accountability systems that made bias immediately visible, legally documented, and economically costly. Dr. Morrison, who had been listening to portions of Isaiah's coordination calls, asked the question that many healthcare professionals worldwide were considering. Mr. Bennett, the monitoring technology you've demonstrated, how quickly could it be adapted for medical settings where unconscious bias affects patient care and treatment decisions? Isaiah's response revealed the broader scope of Nexus Digital's development work. Dr. Morrison healthcare applications are already in advanced testing. Emergency room bias detection, prescription monitoring, specialist referral analysis, insurance approval patterns. Anywhere that subjective human judgment affects patient outcomes, we can identify discriminatory patterns and provide real-time intervention recommendations. Elena Vasquez, who had been documenting everything for legal purposes, posed the question that would define regulatory frameworks from a civil rights law perspective. How do you address privacy concerns while maintaining comprehensive monitoring that can prevent discrimination? Transparency and consent are fundamental. Isaiah explained his response, reflecting months of legal consultation and ethical review. All monitoring is disclosed to participants. All data is anonymized for pattern analysis, and all consequences are based on documented behavioral patterns, rather than individual conversations or personal information. The goal isn't surveillance. It's identifying systematic disparities and providing intervention before discrimination affects outcomes. Tyler Brooks, whose live stream had become a masterclass in real-time civil rights documentation, asked about scalability. Mr. Bennett, what you've demonstrated today, can this approach address discrimination in other critical areas, like housing, employment, education, criminal justice? Isaiah's smile suggested this was exactly the direction he'd hoped the conversation would take. Mr. Brooks, Nexus Digital has been developing bias monitoring systems for multiple sectors. What you've witnessed today is a proof of concept, demonstrating how real-time accountability can create systematic change. The applications are limited only by our ability to develop sector-specific algorithms and legal frameworks. Elena Santos's voice came through Isaiah's earpiece with an update that surprised even him. Isaiah, we're receiving inquiries from international human rights organizations. The European Union wants to discuss implementing bias monitoring requirements for all major service providers operating within EU borders. The United Nations Human Rights Office is requesting consultations on using similar systems to address institutional discrimination globally. Tyler's journalism professor had texted him during the flight. Tyler, what you're documenting isn't just a news story. It's the real-time implementation of a new paradigm for civil rights enforcement that could reshape how institutions worldwide address discrimination. As the aircraft prepared for landing in Miami, passengers were beginning to understand that they had witnessed something unprecedented in corporate accountability. The technology that Isaiah had deployed wasn't just sophisticated. It was revolutionary in its approach to making bias visible, costly, and ultimately unsustainable. Madison Pierce, who had triggered the entire demonstration through her racist assumptions, had unknowingly become the catalyst for a global transformation in how discrimination would be identified, documented, and prevented across multiple industries and national borders. Isaiah's phone displayed final Phase 5 confirmation as the wheels touched Miami tarmac. Systematic transformation, confirmed and expanding, industry standards permanently altered, federal oversight, comprehensively engaged international adoption, accelerating individual accountability, implemented with precision, mission status objectives exceeded by 340%. Next phase, global implementation authorized. The flight was over, but the transformation was just beginning to reshape how human societies would approach fairness, accountability, and systematic justice. While Isaiah Bennett was systematically implementing changes that would reshape multiple industries, Madison Pierce was experiencing the kind of comprehensive professional and personal destruction that occurs when entitled behavior collides with unavoidable accountability. Slumped in seat 1B, the seat she should have occupied from the beginning, Madison was frantically attempting to control a narrative that had already spiraled beyond any possibility of damage control. Her first instinct had been complete digital erasure. The live stream segments where she'd made explicitly racist comments, the Instagram stories where she'd performed victimhood while engaging in discrimination, the TikTok videos where she'd laughed about teaching people their place. All of it needed to disappear immediately. But the internet is unforgiving, and screenshots are permanent. Within minutes of beginning her deletion frenzy, Madison discovered that her content had been archived, screen-recorded, and shared thousands of times. Her own followers were now using her discriminatory behavior as evidence against her, creating a feedback loop of accountability she couldn't escape. Besties, There's been a huge misunderstanding about my flight today. Madison typed into her Instagram story with shaking hands, her usual confidence replaced by barely controlled panic. There was major confusion about seats, and I was just trying to protect myself as a young woman alone. My words came out wrong, and my heart is broken that people think I would ever discriminate. I love everyone, regardless of race. The response was immediate and devastating. We literally have video of you saying reverse discrimination. Madison, you told a CEO he belonged in cargo. On camera. Stop gaslighting us, bestie. We have receipts. People like him isn't a misunderstanding. It's racism. The way you're trying to spin documented discrimination. Her business manager, Sarah Chen, was calling frantically. Madison, stop posting immediately. Every word you write is making this exponentially worse. I've been on calls all day. Fashion Nova Revolve, Daniel Wellington. Flat Tummy Tea. They're all terminating contracts, and some are exploring breach of contract lawsuits for reputation damage. How catastrophic is it? Madison asked, though she could see her follower count dropping by thousands with each refresh. Beyond catastrophic. We're talking about $487,000 in annual partnerships eliminated in 6 hours. Major talent agencies are blacklisting you. PR firms won't return my calls. And that's just today. This is going to have long-term implications for any future brand relationships. Madison's entertainment lawyer was even more direct. Madison, you need to understand the legal exposure here. You made discriminatory statements about a civil rights technology CEO on camera in front of multiple professional witnesses while refusing to acknowledge his legal right to a seat he purchased. This could involve federal civil rights violations, and the documented evidence is comprehensive. But it was the personal destruction that was most devastating to Madison's sense of self. Her entire identity had been built around being aspirational, representing a lifestyle that hundreds of thousands of people wanted to emulate. Now she represented everything people despised about privilege entitlement and casual racism. Instagram comments had become a repository of disgust from former fans. I defended you for 3 years, and this is who you really are. Teaching my teenage daughter about white privilege using your video. You showed us exactly who you are when you thought nobody important was watching. Unfollowed, blocked and donated to civil rights organizations in your name. Madison attempted a more comprehensive apology. I want to sincerely apologize for my behavior today. I was overwhelmed and scared and said things that came out completely wrong. I have nothing but respect and love for all people and communities. I'm committed to learning and growing from this experience. I understand I hurt people, and that's the last thing I ever wanted. Please give me a chance to do better. But the response was swift and unforgiving. This sounds like your crisis management team wrote it. Came out wrong. You said he didn't belong in first class. You weren't scared. You were entitled and racist. Apology rejected until you acknowledge what you actually did. The performative accountability is almost worse than the original racism. The most damaging responses came from people who knew her personally. College acquaintances, high school classmates, even family members sharing their own experiences with Madison's problematic behavior. OSU roommate here. Madison always made comments about who deserved to be in honors classes. This behavior isn't new. She literally complained about diversity scholarships taking opportunities from qualified students. We all heard it. Former family friend Madison's parents are mortified. She wasn't raised this way, but fame and social media changed her. Tyler Brooks's TikTok had become the central documentation source for Madison's meltdown, with viewers sharing screenshots of her desperate posts and tracking her real-time loss of followers, brand partnerships, and social credibility. The hashtag Madison Meltdown was trending alongside Flight 284 and systematic accountability. Madison's most desperate attempt came when she tried to reframe herself as the victim of an unfair pile-on. I'm receiving death threats and hate mail because of a situation that was completely misunderstood and blown out of proportion. I'm just a young woman trying to build a business and support myself. The man involved is a billionaire with teams of lawyers and PR people. How is it fair for someone with that much power to destroy my life over a misunderstanding? This feels like targeted harassment. The response was brutal and immediate. A misunderstanding. Ma'am, we have comprehensive video evidence. You targeted him first with your racism. How is it fair? The same energy you had when you told him he didn't belong. This is consequences, not harassment. Imagine calling accountability. Targeted harassment. Dr. Morrison, who had been monitoring social media coverage during the flight, actually read Madison's victim narrative aloud to Elena Vasquez with something approaching amazement. She's calling Isaiah Bennett the aggressor. Dr. Morrison showed her phone to Elena, the man who sat quietly in his assigned seat while she made racist comments and refused to move, is somehow the villain in her version of events. Elena shook her head with the recognition of someone who'd seen this pattern in discrimination cases. It's classic Darvo. Deny, attack, and reverse victim and offender. When people are caught engaging in discriminatory behavior but can't acknowledge what they've done, they try to reframe themselves as the ones being victimized by accountability. Madison's final desperate attempt was the most revealing. She posted a tearful video from what appeared to be an airplane bathroom makeup, streaked speaking directly to her camera, with raw desperation. Please, just listen to me for 1 minute. I'm not the monster everyone is making me out to be. I made a mistake today. A really bad mistake. But I'm not racist. I have black friends. I donate to charities. I voted for Obama twice. This doesn't represent who I really am as a person deep down. One moment of poor judgment is destroying everything I've worked for. Please stop ruining my life over something that got taken out of context. The response was merciless. Your black friends deserve better. Voting for Obama doesn't erase documented racism. This is who you are. You just got caught. Taking accountability means more than just saying sorry. Ma'am, this was not taken out of context. As Flight 284 touched down in Miami, Madison Pierce was learning a harsh lesson about accountability in an era of comprehensive documentation and real-time social media justice. There was no walking back explicit discrimination when it was captured from multiple angles, witnessed by professionals, and broadcast to hundreds of thousands of people. Her influence was gone, her income was eliminated, and her reputation was permanently damaged. But more significantly, her discriminatory behavior had become evidence in a systematic effort to address bias across the entire transportation industry. Madison Pierce had become both the face of entitled racism and living proof that discriminatory behavior could no longer hide behind social status, victim narratives, or claims of misunderstanding. The digital age had made accountability immediate, comprehensive, and inescapable. As Flight 284's landing gear touched the Miami tarmac with a gentle bump that seemed anticlimactic after the historic events of the previous 4 hours, Isaiah Bennett was orchestrating the most comprehensive response to airline discrimination that the transportation industry had ever witnessed. This transcended individual consequences. It was about implementing systematic changes that would prevent similar incidents across the entire airline industry and multiple related sectors. Elena Santos's voice came through Isaiah's secure connection with updates that demonstrated the unprecedented scope of Equity Protocol Delta 7's success. Isaiah, the regulatory response is breaking every precedent we studied. The FAA has announced they're implementing emergency bias reporting requirements for all major carriers effective within 30 days. The Department of Transportation is launching comprehensive discrimination reviews across the entire transportation sector. The Civil Rights Commission wants to use Flight 284 as the template for bias detection in all federally regulated industries. Isaiah reviewed real-time data on his tablet, showing cascading effects across multiple systems. Immediate systematic changes. 6:47 p.m. East Airline. Industry transformation. United Express. Comprehensive bias training. Mandatory for 47,000 employees. Delta Connection. Voluntary monitoring systems. Activated across 847 aircraft. American Eagle partnership negotiations elevated to emergency board priority. Southwest proactive compliance review. Initiated consultant requests. Sent JetBlue federal audit. Requested voluntarily to demonstrate good faith. Alaska Airlines Policy Review Committee formed. External consultants hired. Federal oversight activation. 6 formal investigations across 4 agencies. Congressional hearings scheduled within 72 hours. New federal transportation. Bias prevention guidelines drafted. Multi-agency civil rights. Task force formation authorized. International aviation organizations requesting coordination. Corporate governance. Revolution. 27. Major companies requesting nexus. Digital bias. Monitoring consultations. Stock market. ESG compliance criteria. Expanded to include bias prevention. Insurance companies developing discrimination liability. Coverage. Products. Investment funds creating civil rights compliance. Screening criteria. But the most profound changes were happening within the Flight 284 cabin itself. Jessica Chen, the flight attendant who had initially enabled discrimination by asking Isaiah to step aside, approached his seat with an expression mixing professional respect with personal accountability that would define her career transformation. Mr. Bennett, I need you to know that I've submitted formal requests for immediate comprehensive bias training, ongoing supervision, and mentorship from civil rights professionals. Jessica said, her voice steady, despite the obvious weight of the moment. I failed my professional obligations today, and I understand that my failure contributed to systematic discrimination that affects countless passengers. Isaiah looked at Jessica with an expression that was serious, but carried the possibility of redemption. Ms. Chen, genuine accountability is the foundation of institutional change. Your willingness to acknowledge mistakes, seek improvement, and commit to preventing future incidents is exactly the kind of response that transforms workplace cultures, rather than just punishing individuals. Dr. Morrison, observing from seat 2C, added her professional perspective. Mr. Bennett, as someone who has experienced discrimination in healthcare settings, I'm particularly interested in how you ensure that individual accountability leads to broader institutional reform, rather than just creating scapegoats who absorb blame while systems remain unchanged. Isaiah's response revealed the sophisticated framework underlying Equity Protocol Delta 7. Dr. Morrison, that's the essential distinction between punishment and accountability. Punishment focuses on individuals and often creates resentment that prevents cultural transformation. Systematic accountability focuses on changing institutional structures, creating learning opportunities, and building systems that prevent discrimination before it affects outcomes. He gestured toward Derek Hamilton, who was standing near the aircraft exit with his personal belongings waiting for airport security escort. Mr. Hamilton's termination isn't just about his individual choices during this incident. It's about demonstrating to airline managers industry-wide that enabling discrimination has immediate career consequences, creating systematic incentives for fair treatment and policy adherence. Elena Vasquez, who had been documenting everything for what she understood would be precedent-setting legal proceedings, asked the constitutional question underlying everything, Mr. Bennett, from a civil rights law perspective. How do you balance comprehensive accountability with due process and individual rights? 3-tiered systematic accountability. Ms. Vasquez Isaiah replied his response, reflecting months of constitutional law consultation. Individual consequences for people who engage in discriminatory behavior with proportionality, based on severity and willingness to change. Institutional consequences for organizations that enable or ignore bias with remediation requirements and ongoing monitoring. And systematic consequences for entire industries that fail to address documented patterns of discrimination, including regulatory oversight and federal compliance requirements. Tyler Brooks, whose live stream had evolved into historical documentation of corporate accountability, asked the question his 95,000-plus viewers were discussing in real time. What happens to people who experienced discrimination before monitoring systems existed? Is there justice for historical incidents that were never properly documented? Isaiah's smile carried the weight of strategic planning that extended far beyond this single flight. That's precisely why this intervention is systematic, rather than just reactive. Mr. Brooks, the comprehensive data we've collected through bias monitoring identifies historical patterns of discrimination that can be addressed through class action litigation, institutional remediation programs, and systematic policy changes that provide justice for past harm while preventing future incidents. Elena Santos's voice provided an update that demonstrated global implications. Isaiah International response is accelerating beyond projections. The European Union is fast-tracking legislation requiring bias monitoring for all major service providers. Canada's Human Rights Commission wants immediate consultations. The United Nations Human Rights Office is requesting briefings on using technology for systematic discrimination prevention. As passengers began gathering their belongings for deplaning, the scope of transformation became clear to everyone who had witnessed the Flight 284 intervention. Tyler's live stream, which had maintained over 100,000 concurrent viewers throughout the incident, had become a real-time case study in how comprehensive documentation and systematic response could create immediate accountability for institutional discrimination. Dr. Morrison stood and addressed the cabin with the authority of someone who had spent decades fighting bias in professional settings. Ladies and gentlemen, I want everyone to understand the historical significance of what you've witnessed today. This wasn't just about airline discrimination or individual consequences. This was the implementation of accountability systems that can identify and address institutional bias before it becomes entrenched, before it harms more people, before it requires expensive litigation to resolve. Her words carried professional weight that made passengers pause in their deplaning preparations. Mr. Bennett didn't just document discrimination. He created a replicable framework for transforming how institutions address bias across multiple industries. What happened here will protect countless people from experiencing similar treatment. Elena Vasquez added her legal perspective. From a civil rights standpoint, Flight 284 represents a new paradigm for addressing institutional discrimination. Instead of reactive complaint processes that take years and often fail, we witnessed real-time intervention with immediate consequences and systematic prevention protocols. Madison Pierce, who had been silent during most of the deplaning process, finally looked up from her phone with an expression that mixed devastation with something approaching genuine recognition. Mr. Bennett, I want you to know that I'm beginning to understand how my behavior affected not just you, but everyone who witnessed it, and everyone who will benefit from the changes you're implementing. I don't expect forgiveness, but I want to commit to doing the work necessary to become a better person. Isaiah looked at Madison with an expression that was neither harsh nor forgiving, but thoughtfully evaluative. Ms. Pierce's personal growth requires genuine acknowledgement of harm, caused and sustained commitment to examining the assumptions and privileges that led to discriminatory behavior. The question is whether you're willing to do the difficult work of understanding how your beliefs about who belongs in certain spaces have affected your interactions with others throughout your life, not just today. As Isaiah walked through Miami International Airport, no longer just a passenger who had experienced discrimination, but the architect of systematic changes that would reshape corporate accountability. He carried the satisfaction of knowing that the transformation initiated today would prevent millions of people from experiencing the discrimination he'd endured throughout his life. Elena Santos's final operational update came as Isaiah reached the baggage claim. Isaiah immediate impact assessment confirms comprehensive success. We have irrefutable documentation of explicit discrimination, multiple professional witness testimonies, real-time social media coverage, reaching millions, and systematic institutional responses across the transportation industry. Flight 284 will become the template for addressing bias in regulated industries worldwide. The flight was complete, but the destination had been reached a fundamental shift in how discrimination would be identified, documented, and prevented across industries' borders and institutional structures that had operated without effective oversight for generations. The seat that Madison Pierce had tried to claim through racist assumptions had become the foundation for systematic justice that would protect future generations from experiencing the indignities that had shaped Isaiah Bennett's entire life. By 8 p.m. Eastern Time, less than 12 hours after Flight 284 had departed Denver, the incident had evolved from viral social media content into the lead story on every major news network worldwide, with coverage intensity that surprised even Elena Santos, who had coordinated media strategy for dozens of high-profile civil rights interventions. CNN's Anderson Cooper opened his evening broadcast with Tyler Brooks' original TikTok footage, now viewed over 8.4 million times. What you're about to see may be the most comprehensive real-time documentation of airline discrimination ever captured, but more significantly, it's the systematic response that's already reshaping corporate accountability across multiple industries. But the media narrative had transcended simple airline discrimination to explore something revolutionary, a demonstration of how technology, strategic planning, and comprehensive documentation could create immediate institutional accountability for bias that had previously been ignored, dismissed, or buried in bureaucratic processes. MSNBC's Rachel Maddow devoted her entire opening segment to the broader implications. Isaiah Bennett didn't just expose discrimination on one flight. He demonstrated a replicable methodology for addressing systematic bias that could be applied to healthcare, financial services, education, housing, anywhere that subjective human judgment affects people's access to services or opportunities. The international coverage demonstrated global implications that extended far beyond American transportation. BBC News led their worldwide service. American CEOs, bias detection technology, triggers international interest in systematic discrimination prevention. Within hours, Air Canada, British Airways, Lufthansa, and Qantas had issued statements expressing interest in implementing comprehensive bias monitoring systems. The business media was analyzing financial implications that were reshaping entire investment categories. CNBC's Jim Cramer reported, Skyline Airways lost $3.1 billion in market value in 8 hours, while companies implementing bias monitoring systems saw institutional investor confidence surge. We're witnessing the emergence of a new ESG investment criterion: systematic civil rights compliance. Fox Business examined the disruption to traditional corporate governance structures, with Maria Bartiromo highlighting Isaiah Bennett used equity stakes and technology to implement operational changes that shareholder proposals and board activism couldn't achieve. This represents a fundamental evolution in how corporate accountability can be enforced through market mechanisms. The social media metrics were unprecedented across all platforms. Equity protocol trending in 47 countries, 23.7 million mentions, Flight 284, 890,000 video shares, translated into 23 languages. Madison Pierce, 12.3 million mentions. 96%. Critical of discriminatory behavior. Systematic accountability. New hashtag trending among civil rights advocates. The most powerful social media responses came from civil rights leaders who recognized the historical significance at reshaped. Isaiah Bennett's Flight 284. Intervention represents civil rights activism evolution, using technology and legal preparation to create systematic change rather than just highlighting individual incidents. At AOC, this is what happens when someone uses wealth and power to build systems that protect people instead of exploiting them. Isaiah Bennett just showed corporate America what accountability looks like. At Dr. Bernice King, my father would have embraced this approach. Strategic preparation, comprehensive documentation, and systematic transformation. Technology in service of justice. But it was the industry-specific coverage that demonstrated the far-reaching implications. Healthcare executives were calling medical news outlets to discuss bias monitoring in hospital systems. Financial services companies were reaching out to business journalists about loan approval discrimination detection. University administrators were talking to education reporters about admissions equity technology. Dr. Morrison, who had become a key witness, was interviewed by CNN's Sanjay Gupta about healthcare applications. What Isaiah Bennett created extends far beyond airlines. This technology could revolutionize how we identify and address bias in medical treatment insurance coverage, prescription patterns, specialist referrals, anywhere that unconscious prejudice affects patient outcomes and health equity. Elena Vasquez was fielding calls from legal news organizations about civil rights implications. Flight 284 demonstrates how comprehensive real-time documentation can create accountability that traditional complaint processes have never achieved. It's a new framework for civil rights enforcement that could be applied to employment discrimination, housing bias, educational inequity, any situation where institutional power affects individual rights. Academic institutions were already incorporating the incident into their curricula. Harvard Business School announced development of a case study on using market power for social impact, the Isaiah Bennett model. Stanford's Graduate School of Business scheduled a symposium on technology-enabled corporate accountability and systematic bias prevention. Wall Street Journal's editorial analysis was particularly influential. Bennett's approach represents a new form of stakeholder capitalism, using equity positions not just to influence corporate governance, but to implement comprehensive monitoring systems that ensure sustainable social responsibility. This could reshape how institutional investors approach ESG criteria and corporate accountability. International business media recognized global implications. Financial Times reported, European airlines are proactively implementing bias monitoring systems ahead of anticipated EU regulatory requirements, citing the Flight 284 incident as evidence that discrimination prevention is both morally necessary and economically prudent. Technology publications examined broader applications of bias detection systems. Wired magazine prepared a cover story, how AI-powered discrimination detection could transform every industry that serves the public. The entertainment industry was taking notice with unprecedented seriousness. Within hours, 3 major production companies had contacted Tyler Brooks about documentary rights. Netflix announced development of a limited series exploring systematic bias in corporate America. HBO was discussing a feature documentary about technology-enabled civil rights activism. But perhaps the most significant coverage came from airline industry publications, which recognized that Isaiah Bennett had fundamentally altered how transportation companies would be required to operate. Aviation Week's analysis was unambiguous. The era of airline discrimination existing without immediate consequences ended on Flight 284. Every major carrier will need comprehensive bias monitoring systems, or face the kind of systematic exposure and financial liability that no airline can survive in today's market environment. The speed and global scope of media coverage reflected something unprecedented. A single incident documented so comprehensively, with such immediate and extensive consequences, that it couldn't be dismissed, minimized, or managed through traditional corporate PR strategies. By midnight Eastern Time, the Flight 284 story had generated over 47 million social media interactions, spawned hundreds of reaction videos, prompted statements from dozens of corporations, and triggered federal investigations that would reshape transportation industry regulation. Madison Pierce was discovering the devastating power of negative media coverage. Entertainment. Tonight, TMZ and Page 6 were running segments about her career collapse, but they were framing it as a cautionary tale about accountability rather than celebrity gossip. Her story had become a warning about the consequences of explicit racism in an era of comprehensive documentation. The media firestorm wasn't just covering news. It was documenting the real-time implementation of systematic change that would affect how corporate bias was identified, monitored, and addressed across industries' borders and regulatory frameworks. Isaiah Bennett, who had planned for extensive media coverage as part of his systematic response strategy, was fielding calls from international organizations wanting to understand how bias monitoring technology could be adapted for their own country's struggles with institutional discrimination. The Flight 284 story had become global evidence that comprehensive accountability could create systematic transformation, and media outlets worldwide were exploring what that meant for their society's ongoing battles against institutional bias and corporate discrimination. 6 months after Flight 284, the personal reckonings for everyone involved had crystallized into permanent life changes that reflected the broader themes of accountability, redemption, and the true cost of discriminatory behavior in an era of comprehensive documentation and systematic justice. Madison Pierce's influencer empire hadn't just collapsed. It had been systematically dismantled by the same algorithmic systems that had once promoted her content. Her Instagram account, which had peaked at 2.3 million followers, had stabilized at 47,000. Mostly accounts that followed her for anthropological interest in watching someone navigate public disgrace. The financial devastation was comprehensive and ongoing. Her business manager's final accounting had been devastating. Madison, your annual income from sponsored content was $487,000. You now have 0 brand partnerships, 0 prospects for new ones, and 3 companies are pursuing breach of contract lawsuits for reputation damage clauses. Your total measurable income loss exceeds $2.1 million when you factor in projected career earnings. But the financial consequences extended far beyond lost income. Madison's Miami Beach apartment, rented at $4,800 monthly to provide luxury backdrops for content creation, had been terminated by landlords concerned about media attention. Her Range Rover had been voluntarily surrendered when payments became impossible. The designer wardrobe that had been business expenses when she had business now represented crushing debt without income. Most devastatingly, the psychological destruction had forced Madison to confront how her entire identity had been built on exclusion and performance. Working with Dr. Angela Roberts at the Racial Justice Education Initiative in Columbus, Madison, was processing the painful reality that her need to claim premium spaces had led her to deny others legitimate rights to those same spaces. Madison. What happened on Flight 284 revealed belief systems that didn't develop overnight. Dr. Roberts had explained during one of their therapy sessions. The assumptions you made about who belonged in first class were part of a worldview that you'd been building for years. Recovery requires examining every interaction where you've used perceived status to exclude others. The work was humbling and necessary. Madison's presentations to college students and young professionals began with unflinching accountability. 2 years ago, I made racist assumptions about who deserved to be in first class and voiced those assumptions to thousands of people. I destroyed my career, harmed someone's dignity, and revealed aspects of myself that required complete reconstruction. I'm here to help you recognize unconscious bias before it leads to the explicit discrimination I engaged in. Her family relationships had been strained, but were slowly healing. Her parents in Columbus had been devastated by the national attention, but they'd supported Madison's decision to engage in genuine accountability work rather than attempting to rebuild her influencer career. "We didn't raise you to treat people the way you treated that man," her mother had said. "But we're proud of you for doing the difficult personal work to become better, instead of making excuses or blaming others." Derek Hamilton's professional destruction had been swift and industry-wide, but his personal reckoning had led to unexpected growth. His 15-year airline management career had ended not with retirement or promotion, but with termination for enabling discrimination on camera in front of professional witnesses. The airline industry's interconnected nature meant Derek's involvement in Flight 284 had spread through professional networks within hours. Executive recruiters who had previously courted him were no longer returning calls. Industry contacts avoided association at the moment when networking was crucial for employment. His family had paid unexpected costs. Derek's wife, Linda, had lost her substitute teaching position in Denver, officially due to budget cuts, but the timing coincided with parents questioning whether someone married to a person who made discriminatory decisions should teach their children. Their teenage daughter, Emma, faced social media harassment from classmates who had seen the viral footage. But Derek was also experiencing personal growth through confronting his unconscious biases. Working with Dr. Patricia Williams, who specialized in helping professionals address discriminatory behavior, Derek was examining assumptions he'd never questioned. Derek, Flight 284 wasn't a mistake. It was a reveal Dr. Williams had explained. "You made assumptions about passenger value based on appearance and social media presence, rather than examining basic evidence. Understanding that pattern is essential for ensuring it never happens again." Derek had found meaningful work with a nonprofit, helping formerly incarcerated individuals find employment. His own experience with career consequences for poor decision-making had given him empathy for others facing similar challenges. "I used to think people who complained about discrimination were exaggerating," Derek admitted during a group therapy session. "But when you're the one facing consequences for behavior you didn't recognize as problematic, you start understanding how systematic bias affects people's opportunities and dignity." Jessica Chen's journey had been the most complex, reflecting the airline industry's struggle with addressing employees who had engaged in discriminatory behavior but were willing to acknowledge mistakes and commit to improvement. Skyline Airways had suspended Jessica initially, but her union's argument for rehabilitation rather than termination had proven successful. Jessica's immediate acknowledgement of her mistakes and request for additional training represents exactly the kind of response that creates cultural change, her representative had argued. Jessica's new role involved comprehensive bias prevention training for airline employees, using her own experience as an example of how well-intentioned people could make discriminatory choices without recognizing them as such. The most important lesson from Flight 284, Jessica explained during her presentations, is that unconscious bias affects professional judgment even when we think we're being fair. "I thought I was managing customer satisfaction, but I was actually enabling discrimination because I made assumptions about passenger value based on appearance rather than examining evidence." Her work had expanded beyond airlines to other customer service industries as companies recognized the value of training led by someone who had experienced consequences for bias in their own career. Meanwhile, the people who had demonstrated moral courage were experiencing very different consequences. Dr. Morrison had been contacted by the American Medical Association about leading initiatives to address bias in healthcare settings, with funding to adapt Isaiah's technology for hospital systems. Elena Vasquez was fielding offers from major civil rights organizations and law firms interested in her real-time legal analysis and comprehensive documentation skills. Her work on Flight 284 had demonstrated exactly the kind of strategic thinking that could reshape civil rights litigation. Tyler Brooks had been offered correspondent positions with CNN, MSNBC, and The Washington Post, all focused on social justice documentation and accountability journalism. His instinct for recognizing and documenting systematic bias had opened career opportunities he couldn't have imagined. The contrast was intentional and meaningful. Discriminatory behavior had consequences that matched its harm to individuals and society, while standing up to discrimination created opportunities for positive impact and professional growth. But perhaps the most significant personal consequence was for Isaiah Bennett himself. While media coverage portrayed him as a visionary who had created systematic change, the emotional cost of deliberately exposing himself to discrimination for documentation purposes had required ongoing psychological support. His work with Dr. Sarah Williams, who specialized in racial trauma and systematic activism, had helped Isaiah process the complexity of using personal experiences of bias as evidence for institutional change. Every time you subject yourself to discrimination, even strategically, even with the power to respond, it affects you emotionally, Dr. Williams had explained. The goal is processing those experiences in ways that fuel systematic change rather than personal bitterness. His relationship with daughter Zara had deepened as she became more involved in civil rights technology work, but it also required navigating the complexity of a daughter watching her father voluntarily experience discrimination for systematic purposes. "Dad, seeing you treated with disrespect is painful, even when I know you have the power to create change," Zara had told him. "But watching you transform that treatment into protection for millions of other people, that's the most powerful lesson about using privilege and resources for justice." The personal consequences, 6 months after Flight 284, reflected deeper truths about accountability in the digital age. Individual choices during moments of moral testing had lasting implications that extended far beyond immediate circumstances. Those who had engaged in or enabled discrimination faced consequences proportional to their actions, but genuine accountability had created opportunities for growth and contribution to preventing future bias. Those who had stood up for justice found their courage rewarded with expanded platforms for creating positive change. The Flight 284 participants had become examples of how systematic accountability could transform both institutions and individuals, creating lasting change that protected countless others from experiencing the discrimination that had been comprehensively documented and addressed on one flight from Denver to Miami. 1 year after Flight 284, Isaiah Bennett stood before a joint session of the Congressional Commerce and Judiciary Committees, presenting comprehensive data that revealed the full scope of what the airline incident had accomplished and where the systematic transformation was expanding. The single flight had been the opening move in a coordinated campaign to revolutionize how discrimination was identified, documented, and prevented across industries' borders and institutional structures. Honorable representatives, Isaiah began his voice carrying the quiet authority of someone who had fundamentally altered corporate accountability. The Flight 284 intervention was not an isolated response to airline discrimination. It was a proof-of-concept demonstration that comprehensive bias monitoring and systematic accountability could create transformative change across any institution that serves the public. The statistics he presented painted a picture of transformation that had exceeded even his strategic projections. Equity protocol, global impact, 12-month assessment, transportation sector revolution. 31 countries, Implementing mandatory airline bias. Monitoring. 94% reduction in discrimination complaints across participating systems. 4. $7 billion in litigation costs, avoided through prevention. 78% improvement in customer satisfaction among minority passengers. 156% increase in employee bias, recognition. Training, effectiveness. Healthcare sector. Adoption. 234. Hospital systems, implementing patient treatment. Equity monitoring. 73%. Reduction in care. Disparities across demographic groups. $1.2 billion in improved efficiency through equitable resource allocation. 52% improvement in health outcomes for previously underserved patients. 67%. Reduction in medical malpractice. Claims related to bias. Financial services transformation. 18 countries mandating loan approval bias. Detection systems, $12. $7 billion in additional lending to qualified minority applicants. 82%. Reduction in discrimination-related regulatory violations. 43% increase in customer satisfaction across all demographic groups. 89%. Improvement in regulatory compliance scores. Education sector. Implementation. 156 universities. Using comprehensive admissions bias. Monitoring. 34%. Increase in qualified minority student enrollment. 78%. Improvement in campus diversity. Metrics. 61%. Reduction in discrimination. Complaints in educational settings. 45%. Increase in graduation rates among previously underserved students. Senator Margaret Thompson, chair of the Commerce Committee, asked the question that had brought Isaiah to testify. Mr. Bennett, the transformation you've achieved is remarkable, but I want to understand scalability and sustainability. Can these systems continue expanding while maintaining effectiveness and avoiding regulatory overreach? Isaiah's response revealed the global scope of his strategic vision. Senator, discrimination thrives wherever subjective human judgment affects people's access to services, opportunities, or fundamental rights. The technology we've developed can identify bias patterns in any sector where decisions are documented and outcomes can be measured objectively. He gestured to presentation screens displaying implementation data from 6 continents. We're currently operating bias monitoring systems in urban planning departments to ensure equitable public resource allocation. Law enforcement agencies in 12 cities are using traffic stop and arrest decision monitoring. Corporate HR departments across 47 companies are implementing hiring and promotion bias detection. The applications are limited only by institutional willingness to embrace transparency and accountability. Representative Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez posed the question, driving much of the congressional interest. Mr. Bennett, the private sector applications are impressive, but what about government accountability? Can these systems address bias in federal agencies, court systems, and regulatory processes where discrimination affects citizens' fundamental rights? Isaiah's smile suggested this was exactly the direction he'd hoped the conversation would take. Representative government bias monitoring represents our most significant opportunity for systematic discrimination prevention. Federal agencies make millions of decisions annually that affect citizens' access to benefits, services, and civil rights protections. Comprehensive monitoring could ensure those decisions are based on objective criteria rather than unconscious prejudice or institutional bias. The conversation was interrupted by a secure message from Elena Santos. Isaiah, breaking development. The United Nations Human Rights Council just voted to establish international standards for institutional bias monitoring. The resolution specifically references Flight 284 as proof of concept for technology-enabled discrimination prevention. Isaiah shared the news with the Congressional Committee, which immediately understood the global leadership implications. The United States was positioned to lead international efforts in civil rights technology, but federal agencies needed to move quickly to implement comprehensive bias monitoring before other nations established competing frameworks. Senator Thompson leaned forward. Mr. Bennett, if Congress mandated federal bias monitoring systems, what would implementation look like? Practically, federal implementation would prioritize agencies making high-volume decisions affecting citizen welfare. Social Security disability determinations, VA benefit approvals, immigration, case processing, federal loan applications, housing, assistance programs. The systems would identify decisions that deviate from statistical norms and require human review before implementation, ensuring fairness while maintaining efficiency. Representative Jim Jordan posed the constitutional question underlying much of the discussion. Mr. Bennett, doesn't this level of monitoring raise serious concerns about government surveillance, privacy rights, and federal overreach? Isaiah's response demonstrated the constitutional law framework underlying equity protocol development. Representative bias. Monitoring focuses on decision patterns and outcomes, not individual communications or personal information. All data is anonymized for analysis, and the objective is identifying systematic disparities that suggest institutional bias, not surveilling specific interactions. The privacy protections are actually stronger than many existing government data collection programs, and the focus is on protecting citizens' constitutional rights, rather than expanding government authority. Representative Pramila Jayapal asked the question that revealed Isaiah's ultimate objective. Mr. Bennett, what does complete success look like for this initiative? How do you know when you've achieved the systematic change you're working toward? Isaiah's response carried the weight of personal experience that had shaped his entire approach. Representative success looks like a society where access to services, opportunities, and basic dignity isn't affected by unconscious bias or systematic prejudice, where a 16-year-old black student with perfect grades doesn't get questioned about whether they really deserve their scholarship, where qualified loan applicants receive fair consideration regardless of their names or zip codes, where bias has immediate visible consequences that make discrimination economically and institutionally unsustainable. He paused, looking around the committee room. Success looks like my daughter and her generation inheriting systems where the comprehensive monitoring we've built becomes unnecessary because fair treatment is automatic, not exceptional. The hearing concluded with bipartisan agreement to draft legislation requiring federal agencies to implement bias monitoring systems within 18 months, with Nexus Digital Solutions contracted to develop implementation frameworks and oversight protocols. As Isaiah left the Capitol building, his phone buzzed with messages from Elena Santos. Isaiah International response is accelerating exponentially. The European Union is implementing comprehensive bias monitoring requirements for all major service providers. Canada, Australia, and New Zealand are developing similar legislation. The G20 wants to establish international standards based on our technology frameworks. But it was the personal message from Zara that carried the most weight, Dad. I just watched the congressional testimony online from my Stanford classroom. My professor said you've created the most significant advancement in civil rights enforcement since the 1960s. But more than that, you've shown that systematic change is possible when people use their power and resources to protect others, instead of just protecting themselves. Isaiah's broader mission was becoming clear. Flight 284 had been a demonstration that personal trauma could be transformed into systematic justice through strategic planning, technological innovation, and comprehensive accountability. The airline industry had been the testing ground, but the real work was reshaping how all institutions approached fairness, dignity, and civil rights protection. The mission that had started with a hotel pool in Chicago and crystallized in Seat 1A was now global policy protecting millions of people from experiencing the discrimination that had shaped Isaiah Bennett's life, while creating accountability systems that made bias visible, costly, and ultimately unsustainable across industries and borders. The broader mission was no longer just Isaiah's. It had become a systematic transformation that would protect future generations from institutional discrimination, while ensuring that power, when accumulated, was used to expand justice rather than perpetuate inequality. 2 years after Flight 284, the supporting characters whose moral choices during those crucial hours had been documented and broadcast to millions had found their futures permanently shaped by how they had responded to witnessing discrimination in real time. Dr. Angela Morrison's decision to speak up against Madison Pierce's discriminatory behavior had positioned her as a national leader in healthcare bias prevention. Now serving as Director of Medical Equity Technology for the World Health Organization, she was overseeing implementation of Isaiah's bias monitoring systems across hospital networks in 43 countries. Her work had become deeply personal as well as professional. What I realized during Flight 284, Dr. Morrison explained during a keynote address at the International Medical Ethics Conference, was that my decades of experiencing discrimination in healthcare settings had given me expertise that could prevent other physicians and patients from enduring similar treatment. Silence in the face of institutional bias is professional complicity. The hospital bias monitoring systems Dr. Morrison implemented were generating remarkable results. Emergency room treatment disparities had decreased by 71% across participating systems. Pain medication prescription patterns showed dramatic reduction in demographic disparities. Patient satisfaction among minority communities had increased by 58%, while overall care quality metrics improved across all demographic groups. Her daughter, Dr. Keisha Morrison Williams, had completed her pediatric residency and joined her mother's WHO initiative, focusing specifically on pediatric care equity. Watching my mother stand up on that airplane taught me that professional authority comes with the moral obligation to use it for justice, Keisha explained during a Harvard Medical School conference on healthcare bias prevention. Elena Vasquez's real-time legal analysis during Flight 284 had demonstrated exactly the kind of strategic thinking and comprehensive documentation skills that could reshape civil rights advocacy. She had accepted Isaiah's offer to join Nexus Digital Solutions as Chief Legal Counsel for Global Civil Rights Technology, where she was developing legal frameworks for bias monitoring across different national legal systems. Her immigration law background proved invaluable in creating systems that protected civil rights while respecting privacy concerns and national sovereignty. The Flight 284 case taught me that the most effective civil rights work happens at the intersection of law, technology, and strategic intervention, Elena explained during a United Nations Human Rights Council presentation. Elena was also working with international human rights organizations to adapt bias monitoring for different cultural contexts and legal frameworks. Her coordination with the European Court of Human Rights was helping establish global standards for technology-enabled discrimination prevention that respected both individual rights and cultural differences. Tyler Brooks's journalistic documentation had launched a career in accountability journalism that was reshaping how social justice issues were covered by mainstream media. Now 22, and working as senior correspondent for CNN's Civil Rights and Social Justice Division. Tyler had built his reputation on documenting systematic responses to institutional discrimination. His documentary series, Technology and Justice, the Flight 284 model had won 2 Emmy Awards and was being used in journalism schools worldwide as an example of how citizen journalism could create comprehensive accountability for systematic bias while maintaining ethical standards and legal protections. The ethical framework that guides my work, Tyler explained during a Northwestern University Journalism Ethics Symposium, is whether my documentation serves public interest and creates educational value, or whether it exploits individual suffering for content consumption. Flight 284 taught me the difference between witnessing for justice and performing for social media engagement. Tyler was also developing training programs for high school journalism students, teaching them to recognize and document bias in educational settings while understanding the ethical responsibilities that come with comprehensive documentation capabilities. Jessica Chen's path to professional redemption had become a model for how organizations could address employee bias through education and accountability rather than just punishment. After completing comprehensive bias training and serving as a case study for employee rehabilitation, Jessica had become Director of Bias Prevention Training for the International Air Transport Association. Her presentations to airline staff worldwide always began with unflinching accountability. I made discriminatory decisions during Flight 284 that violated both company policy and basic human dignity. But my mistake became an opportunity to learn and help others recognize how unconscious bias affects professional judgment even among well-intentioned people. Jessica's training programs, based on her lived experience of making discriminatory choices despite good intentions, had contributed to a 67% reduction in bias incidents across airline systems where they were implemented. Her work had expanded to other customer service industries as companies recognized the effectiveness of bias prevention training, led by people who had experienced consequences for discriminatory behavior. The most important lesson I learned, Jessica reflected during an international customer service ethics conference, is that good intentions don't prevent discriminatory behavior. Only comprehensive awareness training, systematic accountability, and ongoing cultural change can create workplace environments where bias doesn't affect how we treat people. Jessica was pursuing a master's degree in organizational psychology with plans to specialize in helping corporations develop inclusive cultures that prevent discrimination before it affects customer interactions or employee experiences. The supporting character transformations demonstrated that Flight 284 had created ripple effects extending far beyond airline policy. Each person whose choices had been documented during those crucial hours had found their careers and influence expanded or redirected based on how they had responded to witnessing systematic discrimination. Those who had demonstrated moral courage found their platforms expanded in ways that allowed them to create positive change on global scales. Those who had acknowledged mistakes and committed to growth found meaningful paths to redemption that contributed to preventing future discrimination across multiple industries. The Flight 284 supporting characters had become leaders in bias prevention, civil rights advocacy, accountability, journalism, and institutional reform. Proof that individual moments of moral choice, when comprehensively documented, could catalyze systematic changes that protected millions of people from experiencing discrimination. 5 years after Flight 284, the global landscape of institutional accountability bore no resemblance to the world that had allowed systematic discrimination to flourish unchallenged across industries and borders. Isaiah Bennett's Equity Protocol, Delta 7, had not only become the international standard for bias monitoring, but had catalyzed transformations that extended across sectors, regulatory frameworks, and cultural attitudes toward discrimination prevention. Elena Santos addressed the International Civil Aviation Organization's quinquennial assembly in Montreal, presenting comprehensive data that demonstrated how one documented incident had reshaped corporate accountability worldwide. Distinguished delegates from 193 countries, 5 years ago. Discrimination complaints were processed through bureaucratic systems that resulted in meaningful consequences less than 6% of the time. Globally, Elena reported to the packed assembly hall. Today, with equity protocol systems active across 89% of global transportation operations, bias incidents are identified in real time, documented comprehensively, and addressed with immediate accountability that has transformed how institutions approach civil rights compliance. The transformation statistics were unprecedented. Global institutional transformation. 5-year assessment. Transportation revolution. 67 countries with mandatory bias. Monitoring legislation. 91%. Reduction in discrimination complaints across all participating systems. $23.7 billion in litigation costs avoided through prevention. 134%. Improvement in customer satisfaction among minority passengers. 278% increase in employee bias, recognition, and intervention capabilities. Cross-sector adoption. Explosion. Healthcare. 445 hospital networks across 6 continents using patient care. Equity protocols. Financial services. $89 billion in additional lending to previously underserved communities. Education. 234 universities implementing comprehensive admissions and academic support. Monitoring government services. 34 countries monitoring civil service delivery for demographic disparities. Law enforcement. 289 police departments using interaction analysis for bias prevention. Corporate HR. 247 companies implementing hiring and promotion equity systems. Economic impact analysis. $127 billion annually in improved efficiency through equitable resource allocation. 78%. Reduction in discrimination-related legal costs. Globally. 156%. Increase in customer satisfaction across monitored industries. 89%. Improvement in workplace diversity and inclusion metrics. 67%. Reduction in employee discrimination complaints across participating organizations. But the numbers only captured part of the transformation. The expectation of comprehensive bias monitoring had become so standard that discrimination was no longer economically or institutionally sustainable. Organizations without systematic fairness protocols faced immediate competitive disadvantages, regulatory scrutiny, and public accountability that made bias prevention a business necessity rather than just moral aspiration. Dr. Morrison, now serving as Director of Global Healthcare Equity for the World Health Organization, was presenting parallel results from medical settings. Hospital systems implementing patient care equity protocols have seen transformative improvements in health outcomes across all demographic groups. Emergency room racial disparities have decreased by 79%. Prescription medication bias has been reduced by 73%. Most significantly, patient satisfaction among minority communities has reached statistical parity with majority populations for the first time in documented medical history. The financial services sector had embraced bias monitoring as both legal protection and market expansion opportunity. The World Bank's comprehensive analysis showed that banks using loan approval bias detection had identified and corrected discriminatory practices that were costing them an estimated $47 billion annually in qualified applicants who were being systematically excluded. What Isaiah Bennett demonstrated on Flight 284, explained Janet Yellen during the International Monetary Fund's annual meeting, is that comprehensive bias monitoring isn't just ethically necessary, it's economically beneficial. Financial institutions implementing these systems are seeing expanded market share, reduced regulatory violations, improved customer relationships, and increased profitability across all demographic segments. The hospitality industry had become early adopters after recognizing that service discrimination was measurably affecting customer loyalty and revenue. Major hotel chains implementing reservation and service bias monitoring had seen remarkable improvements in guest satisfaction and repeat business across diverse customer bases. Educational institutions had shown particular enthusiasm for admissions and academic support bias detection, recognizing both federal compliance requirements and mission alignment with equity goals. Universities using comprehensive bias monitoring were identifying qualified applicants who had been systematically overlooked while maintaining or improving academic standards. International adoption had accelerated through both regulatory requirements and competitive advantage recognition. The European Union's comprehensive bias monitoring mandate for all major service providers had driven innovation in discrimination prevention technology while creating market incentives for proactive compliance. The European Commission's quinquennial assessment reported remarkable results. Member states implementing comprehensive discrimination monitoring have seen 84% reduction in bias-related complaints across all monitored sectors. Economic analysis indicates that bias prevention is generating $47.3 billion annually in improved efficiency, reduced litigation costs, and expanded market participation among previously underserved communities. Federal regulatory agencies in the United States had embraced bias monitoring as cost-effective compliance enforcement. The Department of Justice's pilot programs, using comprehensive monitoring for law enforcement interactions, had produced results that exceeded expectations for reducing racial disparities while improving community relations and officer performance. Perhaps most significantly, the technology itself had evolved through widespread implementation and feedback. Machine learning algorithms could now identify increasingly subtle forms of bias across multiple languages, cultural contexts, and institutional frameworks. Natural language processing systems could detect discriminatory communication patterns in real time while providing intervention recommendations that prevented escalation. The transformation was perhaps most visible in the airline industry where it had originated. Skyline. Airways, once synonymous with enabling discrimination, had become the global leader in bias prevention technology. Under CEO Patricia Valdez's leadership, the company had implemented the most comprehensive bias monitoring system in aviation history, transforming their crisis into sustainable competitive advantage. Flight 284 forced us to confront systematic problems we didn't know existed, Patricia explained during the International Air Transport Association's annual summit. But addressing those problems didn't just prevent discrimination, it revolutionized our entire operation. Customer satisfaction is at historic highs across all demographic groups. Employee morale and performance have improved dramatically. Our bias prevention technology has become a model that we're now licensing to airlines worldwide. The ripple effects had transformed airline training regulation and customer expectations. Flight attendant schools taught Isaiah's Flight 284 case as standard curriculum on recognizing and addressing bias. New hire orientation included comprehensive modules on unconscious prejudice, conflict de-escalation, and fair treatment protocols, regardless of passenger appearance or perceived status. Most remarkably, the changes had proven to be self-reinforcing and expanding. Industries implementing bias monitoring were seeing measurable improvements in outcomes efficiency and customer satisfaction that created economic incentives for continued expansion and refinement. The transformation that had begun with one airline seat on one flight had become global standard for institutional accountability. Discrimination hadn't been eliminated, but it had been made visible, costly, and unsustainable across industries' borders and regulatory frameworks. Isaiah Bennett's vision of systematic bias prevention had evolved from proof of concept to international policy creating accountability mechanisms that now protected hundreds of millions of people from experiencing the kind of discrimination he had endured throughout his life, while demonstrating that individual moments of moral courage, supported by strategic preparation and technological innovation, could create transformations that extended far beyond their original catalysts. 5 years after Flight 284, the personal transformations of the key participants had evolved into permanent life changes that reflected the complex realities of accountability, redemption, and systematic change in the digital age. Each individual had been forced to reconstruct fundamental aspects of their identity, relationships, and purpose in ways that demonstrated how single moments of moral testing could create lasting consequences, extending far beyond immediate circumstances. Isaiah Bennett's journey from discrimination victim to architect of systematic change had required ongoing psychological work to process the emotional complexity of deliberately exposing himself to bias for documentation purposes. His therapy sessions with Dr. Sarah Williams had evolved from processing individual trauma to developing frameworks for using personal experiences of discrimination as catalysts for institutional protection of others. The most challenging aspect isn't the discrimination itself, Isaiah reflected during a Harvard Kennedy School symposium on systematic activism. It's maintaining emotional health while using personal trauma as evidence for institutional change. The goal is transforming pain into protection for others, but that requires ongoing psychological support and community. His relationship with daughter Zara had deepened as she became Director of International Educational Equity for Nexus Digital Solutions, overseeing bias, monitoring implementation in universities across 4 continents. Their weekly strategy calls had evolved into collaborative leadership of a global movement toward institutional accountability. "Dad, what you started on Flight 284 has become larger than either of us imagined," Zara told him during their most recent planning session. "We're not just preventing discrimination anymore. We've created economic and legal structures where fairness is profitable, systematic, and sustainable. The systems you built are protecting my generation and the generation that comes after us." Madison Pierce's transformation had been the most dramatic and difficult, but also the most comprehensive in terms of personal growth and contribution to preventing future discrimination. 5 years after her career collapse, she was serving as National Director of Bias Prevention Education, using her experience of engaging in documented racism to help others recognize unconscious prejudice before it led to discriminatory behavior. Her work was authentic, humbling, and necessary. Madison's presentations to college students, young professionals, and corporate training programs always began with unflinching accountability. 5 years ago, I made racist assumptions about who deserved to be in first class and voiced those assumptions to millions of people. I destroyed my career, damaged someone's dignity, and revealed aspects of my character that required complete reconstruction. I'm here to help you recognize unconscious bias before it leads to the explicit discrimination I engaged in. Her book, The Seat I Didn't Deserve: From Entitlement to Accountability, had become required reading in diversity training programs and university courses studying privilege, discrimination, and redemption. The 5th anniversary edition included reflections on the long-term work of examining and changing belief systems that had been shaped by years of unchallenged privilege. "I can never undo the harm I caused Isaiah Bennett and everyone who witnessed my behavior," Madison wrote in the updated conclusion. "But I can use my experience to help others understand how unconscious bias develops into explicit discrimination and how genuine accountability requires ongoing commitment to examining our assumptions about who belongs where and why." Her family relationships had been tested, but ultimately strengthened. Madison's parents had initially been devastated by the national attention, but they had supported her decision to engage in meaningful accountability work rather than attempting to rehabilitate her public image through superficial apologies or image management. Dr. Morrison's moral courage during Flight 284 had expanded her influence in ways that allowed her to address healthcare bias on a global scale. Her work implementing bias monitoring in medical systems had shown remarkable results, but more importantly, it had provided her with a sense of purpose that transformed decades of experiencing discrimination into systematic protection for future patients and medical professionals. For 30 years, I navigated microaggressions and bias in healthcare environments, Dr. Morrison explained during the World Health Organization's annual assembly. Flight 284 taught me that my experiences with discrimination had given me expertise that could prevent other physicians and patients from facing similar treatment. Instead of just surviving institutional bias, I could help eliminate it through systematic intervention. Her collaboration with daughter Keisha in developing pediatric care equity protocols had become a model for intergenerational approaches to civil rights advocacy. Their joint research on childhood healthcare disparities was being implemented in children's hospitals worldwide, ensuring that bias didn't affect medical treatment decisions for the most vulnerable patients. Tyler Brooks had used his journalism career to create comprehensive accountability for discrimination across multiple industries. Now 25, and serving as senior correspondent for international civil rights documentation, Tyler's reporting had expanded beyond individual incidents to focus on systematic responses to institutional bias. His documentary work had evolved into a comprehensive examination of how technology could create accountability for social justice issues. The Peabody Award-winning series, Systematic Justice Technology and Civil Rights, was being used in journalism schools globally as a framework for ethical social justice reporting that created positive change rather than just exposing problems. The ethical question that guides all my work, Tyler explained during a Columbia Journalism School ethics conference, is whether my documentation serves long-term justice and creates educational value that prevents future discrimination, or whether it exploits individual suffering for social media engagement and professional advancement. Jessica Chen had become an international expert in employee rehabilitation and bias prevention training. Her experience of making discriminatory decisions despite good intentions had made her uniquely qualified to help other customer service professionals recognize unconscious prejudice before it affected their interactions with customers. Her work had expanded far beyond airlines to include healthcare, hospitality, financial services, and government agencies. Jessica's training programs based on lived experience of consequences for discriminatory behavior had contributed to systematic reductions in bias incidents across industries where they were implemented. The most important insight from Flight 284, Jessica reflected during an International Customer Service Excellence Conference, is that unconscious bias affects professional judgment, even among people who genuinely intend to treat everyone fairly. Comprehensive training, ongoing accountability, and systematic cultural change are required to ensure that good intentions translate into equitable treatment. The personal growth arcs demonstrated that systematic accountability, when combined with genuine opportunities for redemption, could transform both individuals and institutions. Those who had engaged in discriminatory behavior faced consequences proportional to their actions, but meaningful accountability work had created opportunities to contribute to preventing future bias. Those who had demonstrated moral courage found their platforms expanded in ways that allowed them to create positive change on increasingly larger scales, while maintaining the personal relationships and psychological health necessary for sustained activism and institutional reform. The Flight 284 participants had become living examples of how individual choices during moments of moral testing could create lasting changes that extended far beyond personal consequences to protect countless others from experiencing discrimination. 10 years after Flight 284, Isaiah Bennett stood before the United Nations General Assembly in New York, delivering the keynote address for the International Decade of Systematic Justice. a global initiative that had grown directly from the accountability systems first deployed on that Tuesday morning flight from Denver to Miami. Distinguished delegates, Isaiah began his voice, carrying the authority of someone who had fundamentally transformed how human societies approached fairness and institutional accountability. 10 years ago, discrimination thrived in environments where it could remain hidden, consequence-free, and profitable for institutions that engaged in it. Today, comprehensive monitoring and immediate accountability have created economic and legal frameworks where fair treatment is more profitable than bias across every sector we've studied in 47 countries. The statistics presented to the Global Assembly represented the most comprehensive transformation in civil rights enforcement in human history. Decade of systematic justice. Global impact assessment. Worldwide. Implementation. 89. Countries with comprehensive bias. Monitoring legislation. 94%. Reduction in discrimination complaints across participating systems. $234 billion in litigation costs avoided through prevention globally. 267%. Improvement in service satisfaction among minority populations. Worldwide. Sector transformation complete. Transportation. 97% of global airlines, railways, and public transit using bias detection. Healthcare. 89% of major hospital networks across all continents. Financial services. $340 billion in additional lending to underserved communities. Education. 92% of universities implementing comprehensive admissions and support. Monitoring. Government. 45 countries. Monitoring civil service delivery for demographic equity. Corporate. 78% of Fortune 500 companies using hiring and promotion bias detection. Generational impact. Children born after Flight 284, experiencing 89% less institutional discrimination. University graduation rates achieving statistical parity across demographic groups. Employment discrimination reduced to historically low levels globally. Healthcare outcomes showing elimination of most demographic disparities. Financial services access expanded to previously excluded communities worldwide. But beyond the quantitative measures lay a qualitative transformation that was reshaping human expectations about fairness, dignity, and institutional accountability. The generation coming of age in the post-Flight 284 era had grown up expecting systematic protection from discrimination, rather than hoping individual complaints might eventually create change. Zara Bennett, now 32, and serving as Director General of the United Nations Office for Systematic Justice, had helped coordinate the global implementation that had grown from her father's original vision. Her presentation to the General Assembly demonstrated how bias prevention technology had evolved beyond simple monitoring to create predictive systems that prevented discrimination before it occurred. The technology my father deployed 10 years ago was reactive. It documented discrimination and created accountability. After harm had been done, Zara explained to the International Assembly, today's systems are predictive and preventive. They identify conditions likely to produce biased decisions and provide real-time intervention recommendations that protect people from experiencing discrimination in the first place. The technological evolution had been remarkable. Artificial intelligence systems could now identify potential bias in decision-making processes across languages, cultures, and institutional contexts, with accuracy rates exceeding 97%. Machine learning algorithms predicted and prevented discriminatory outcomes before they affected individuals, while natural language processing provided real-time coaching to help decision-makers recognize and correct unconscious prejudice. Elena Santos, now serving as Director of International Civil Rights Technology Implementation, was coordinating bias monitoring across legal systems and cultural contexts that had once seemed incompatible with systematic accountability measures. The European Union's comprehensive implementation has created the most effective discrimination prevention system in human history, Elena reported. Canada's healthcare bias monitoring has eliminated demographic disparities in medical treatment. Australia's educational equity protocols have achieved statistical parity in academic outcomes across all population groups. But it was the message from Madison Pierce that demonstrated the most profound aspect of the transformation. Now 38, and serving as International Director of Privilege and Bias Education, Madison had spent a decade using her experience of documented racism to help millions of people recognize and address unconscious prejudice. Her video message to the UN Assembly was broadcast from a conference in Geneva, where she was training corporate executives on bias prevention. 10 years ago, I engaged in explicit racism because I had never examined my assumptions about who belonged in premium spaces. That moment of documented discrimination became the catalyst for my life's work, helping others recognize unconscious bias before it leads to the harm I caused. The accountability I experienced wasn't punishment. It was transformation that allowed me to contribute to preventing future discrimination rather than perpetuating it. The personal redemption stories had become integral to the broader transformation. Jessica Chen was now Director of Global Customer Service Equity, implementing bias prevention training across industries worldwide. Tyler Brooks had become the most recognized civil rights journalist of his generation, with his documentation methods taught in journalism schools as the standard for accountability reporting. Dr. Morrison, at 64, was completing her tenure as Director of Global Healthcare Equity, with the knowledge that medical treatment bias had been reduced to historically insignificant levels across participating healthcare systems. Her work with daughter Keisha had ensured that bias prevention would continue evolving with new generations of medical professionals who had been trained in equity-conscious care from the beginning of their careers. As Isaiah concluded his presentation to the UN General Assembly, he reflected on how a single moment of discrimination had become the foundation for systematic justice that now protected hundreds of millions of people worldwide. The seat I was denied on Flight 284 became the catalyst for systems that now protect children who will never experience the discrimination that shaped my life, Isaiah told the international audience. But more importantly, we've created economic and legal frameworks where bias prevention is profitable, systematic, and permanent. Elena Santos sent him a final message as delegates began filing out of the assembly hall. Isaiah, congratulations on the decade of systematic justice presentation. But I have news about the next phase. The International Criminal Court wants to discuss using bias monitoring technology to address systematic discrimination as a component of crimes against humanity. This is expanding beyond corporate accountability into international justice frameworks. Isaiah smiled, understanding that the work would never be complete, but that the systems created would continue protecting future generations. The seat in 1A that had started everything had become a symbol of systematic accountability that had fundamentally altered how human societies approached fairness, dignity, and justice. Standing in the United Nations building, looking out at delegates who were now implementing bias monitoring in their own countries, Isaiah Bennett felt the profound satisfaction of knowing that his daughter, and millions of other children around the world, would inherit systems where discrimination was not just morally wrong, but economically impossible and institutionally unsustainable. The flight that began with one man's refusal to accept discriminatory treatment had ended with global transformation of how institutions approached human dignity. The destination had been reached, a world where systematic accountability made discrimination visible, costly, and ultimately obsolete as a tool of institutional power. That's the incredible true story of how one moment of courage on Flight 284 transformed not just one airline, not just one industry, but our entire world's approach to fairness and accountability. Isaiah Bennett showed us that when we combine strategic preparation with moral courage and cutting-edge technology, we can create systematic change that protects millions of people from experiencing discrimination. If this story inspired you to think differently about accountability justice and how individual actions can create massive change, please hit that like button to help this story reach more people. Subscribe to the channel for more incredible true stories of courage and transformation. And share this video with someone who needs to hear how one person's refusal to accept unfair treatment became the foundation for global justice. What would you have done in Isaiah's position? What would you have done if you witnessed Madison's behavior? Let me know in the comments below. Together we can continue building a world where everyone is treated with dignity and respect, regardless of who they are or where they come from. Thanks for watching, and remember, your voice matters, your actions matter, and accountability matters. See you in the next video.